Hey and welcome back to the channel. This will be my last video of the year, so I wanted to do something slightly different. I've compiled my top 10 builds of 2024 all into this one video. There's a bit of everything for you to enjoy, including terrariums, aquariums, paludariums and even some shallow ponds. Before getting into it, I just want to say a massive thank you for all the support this year, for liking and just watching the videos. It really doesn't go unnoticed and I do really appreciate it. Now without further ado, sit back and enjoy my top 10 builds of 2024. In this video, I'll be creating a jungle terrarium for an absolutely beautiful creature known as an orchid mantis. Don't be fooled by its stunning appearance, as this mantis quite literally eats its prey alive. Let's waste no time and get straight into the build. It's going to be a good one. Let's start right at the beginning by creating the glass tank. To build the tank, I'm going to use the glass from these frameless picture frames. They're very inexpensive and you can find them pretty much anywhere. Some frames come with glass that's 1mm in thickness. Try to avoid these as it's just too thin and fragile. The glass I've got here is 2mm, which is much stronger and easier to work with. Now it's time to start cutting the glass down. You'll need a ruler, a marker pen and a glass cutter. If you've never cut glass before, it's really not too difficult, so don't be intimidated. I'm starting by marking down some measurements that I want to cut the glass down to. A really good tip is to place some pieces of blue tack on the back side of your ruler. This stops it from slipping and results in much straighter cuts. I'm firmly pressing the glass cutter down and pulling it back in one continuous motion. With a nice straight scoreline created, it's time to snap the glass. The easiest way I've found of doing this is by placing a long wooden skewer underneath the scoreline and then gently pressing down on both sides. It snaps with ease and you're left with a perfectly straight cut. I'll continue the same process until all the pieces have been cut out. Before sanding the glass down, I'm going to do a quick test fit. I'm using electrical tape to lock the pieces together and being extremely careful as the glass is very sharp. I do this before sanding just in case I've made a mistake, so that way I don't waste time perfecting a piece that's actually the wrong size. Because this glass was from picture frames, the sides that I didn't cut are very smooth and don't need to be sanded. The only sides that need sanding down are the ones that were cut. It's important to wet the glass and sandpaper before sanding, as this helps eliminate glass dust. With all the glass sanded, cleaned and dried, it's time to start assembling. This is some aquarium grade silicone and I'm applying a thin bead along the glass. As a good rule of thumb, the bead of silicone should be no thinner than the thickness of the glass. In this case, that's 2mm. I like to make it slightly thicker just to be on the safe side. With the silicone applied, I can now start carefully assembling the tank. I'm applying a secondary bead of silicone along the interior of the glass and then going ahead and smoothing it out with my finger. It's been 24 hours and the silicone has fully cured. Obviously it still needs a front and top, but I'm going to install something else first. I want this terrarium to have a background covered in moss that the plants can also use to grow up on. I'm going to use these sheets of egg crate to create a divider at the back of the tank with a small gap behind. This gap can then be filled in with a growing medium for moss and plants. I do think the holes in the egg crate are a bit small, so I'm going to use some scissors to cut out some bigger ones. I should mention I'll leave links to all the materials for this build in the description below in case you want to try making something like this yourself. Now the egg crate's in, I can start working on the lid. Instead of having one sheet of glass, I'm attaching two separate pieces with a gap down the middle. The gap can then be covered with this window screen mesh, which will provide some really good ventilation for the terrarium. I've already cut it to size, so I just need to attach it in place. I'm attaching two strips of masking tape, leaving a small gap where a bead of silicone can be applied. I'm now placing the window screen mesh on top and using a toothpick to gently press it down into the silicone. Another bead of silicone can then go on top to sandwich the window screen mesh in place, and then I'm going to smoothen out the bead with a ruler. One important thing to note is to not push the ruler down, as you don't want to be scraping the silicone off. I'm simply gliding it over the surface to create a nice smooth finish. The masking tape can now be removed whilst the silicone is still wet. The result is a clean looking vent that will provide some good air circulation for the terrarium. The tank is almost complete, but it's still missing a door, so let's sort that now. I've cut this glass to size to fit perfectly in the front opening. To start off, I'm going to lock the door in place using some electrical tape. I'm leaving the left side clear of tape, as that's where I'll be creating the hinge. I'm attaching a strip of masking tape, ensuring that I leave a small gap along the side panel of glass. This small gap is very important, as it's how the hinge is going to work. I'm attaching another strip of tape to be flush with the side of the door, and then it's time for the silicone. With a bead of silicone applied, I'm using my finger to spread it out to make sure that it's in contact with both panels of glass. I'll then go over the silicone with a ruler to get a nice smooth finish. Same as earlier, I'm doing this really gently to ensure that I don't remove much whatsoever. I can now remove the masking tape and leave the tank to dry till the next day. The electrical tape holding the door in place can now be removed, and then I can test how the door works. It's working perfectly, and to some people's surprise, this method is actually surprisingly strong. I'm giving it a good pull and it's not budging whatsoever, and I can even hold the weight of the entire tank just by the door. With the glass tank complete, all that's left to do is to tidy it up. After removing all the electrical tape, I can clean up the excess silicone with a sharp blade. As this is a rimless tank, a foam mat will help protect the glass against uneven surfaces. The last task before I can start building the terrarium is checking for leaks. This is easy enough to do by filling the tank up with water and then leaving it for a few hours. There was no leaks whatsoever, so let's get into building this terrarium. I'm going to start off with the drainage layer, also known as the false bottom. This is some fine grade leaker and it should work perfectly. Any small rocks, stones or gravel will work as a great alternative. The purpose of this layer is to provide a place for excess water to sit instead of it sitting in the substrate. This terrarium isn't massive, so it doesn't need to be too deep, but it does matter that it's nice and flat with no high or low points. Next, I'm going to start working on the background. This is sphagnum moss and it's one of the best growing mediums for moss and plants. I'm going to wedge it in the gap behind the egg crate. The reason it's so effective is because it's really good at holding water. This helps maintain high humidity and moisture inside the terrarium, which is essential for tropical plants. The idea is to have the entire background covered in lush green moss with climbing plants growing throughout. Next to go in is this window screen mesh, which will act as a substrate barrier. With that in place, I can now pour in some terrarium substrate. I'm using my regular mix and I'll put all the components up on screen now. I have got a video on my tutorial channel showing you exactly how to make this mix if you wanted some more details. With a decent layer of substrate in, I'm now going to start working on the hardscape. I've got these really cool cork bark branches and I think they're going to work perfectly for what I've got in mind. I want to position them to look like an old branch of a tree that has fallen to the forest floor. After a bit of trial and error, here's where I think they look best, but they do need to be attached together. The easiest and strongest way of doing this is going to be the super glue and tissue method. I'm wedging some tissue between the contact points and then soaking it in some liquid type super glue. It dries fast and forms a really strong bond. I'm also attaching the cork bark to the egg crate to give it a bit more strength. Next, I'm adding a layer of sphagnum moss on top of the substrate. I'm going to be planting some quite fussy plants later, and as they've already been grown on sphagnum moss, I'm hoping this will give them the best chance of thriving. These are georocks, and I think they'll add some really nice detail and interest to the hardscape. I don't want to add too many as I still want to leave plenty of room for the plants. That's the hardscape complete for now, and I do really like how it's turned out. The next step is to start bringing this terrarium to life with moss and plants. This is fern moss, and I think it's going to be the perfect species growing on the background inside this terrarium. It does stay in place on its own, but just to be sure I'm going to anchor it down with some toothpicks. Whilst I finish up planting the background, let me quickly tell you about my terrarium making ebook. It's absolutely packed with useful information, and it's a great read for beginners or if you just want to upgrade your terrarium knowledge. If you've never made a terrarium before, it will give you a massive head start and help you avoid some of the unfortunate mistakes that all beginners go through. If you're interested, there'll be a link in the description as well as the pinned comment. I've crushed up some leaf litter and I'm adding it on top of the sphagnum moss throughout the terrarium. This will not only make the terrarium look more natural, but it'll also serve as a place for microfauna such as springtails to thrive. I'm loving how this scape is looking so far, but it's certainly in need of some more plants. I got these bromeliads for my giant vampire crab paludarium, but they were much smaller than expected, so I never actually used them. I do however think they're the perfect size for this small terrarium, so it's worked out pretty well. These are epiphytic plants, so they don't need to be planted into the substrate. Once I'm happy with their placement, I'll attach them in place with some gel type superglue. They'll grow their own anchoring roots in no time at all, which will reinforce their positions. Another method of planting is to use thread to tie them to the hardscape. I've tied this one to a rock and I can simply place it inside the terrarium or even move it if I ever wanted to. I really like the jungle feel that these plants bring to the scape, but there's still plenty more to come. This is an aquatic plant known as hygrophila. Although it's sold as an aquarium plant, it does grow really well in terrarium conditions. So long as the humidity is kept high, this plant will thrive. I'm mainly planting it in the background by wedging the stem through the fern moss into the sphagnum moss. Next to go in is this stunning cutting of Ficus quercifolia. I think this plant will look great climbing up the cork bark. To hold it in place, I'm going to use these stainless steel staples which I've bent to create small pins. These push into the cork bark nice and easy and help keep the cuttings in place. After a light spray down, it's time to add the feature plant. This is a jewel orchid. Its leaves are absolutely stunning and they look like they've got lightning bolts shooting through them. I think the perfect spot for it is growing between the two cork bark trunks. These here are some cuttings of Photonia. Although they have no roots at the moment, I'll plant them in up to the first set of leaves and they'll grow their own root systems in no time. This is a terrarium plant that's a bit harder to come by. It's got these beautiful iridescent leaves which are a dark red on their underside. This plant does like to climb, so I'm hoping it's going to make its way up the background. This is another stunning begonia species which is a bit harder to grow, so I'm hoping it's going to take off inside this terrarium. With the planting pretty much complete, I'm going to add a few patches of moss to cover up any exposed glue and add a bit more detail. The terrarium is almost complete, but there's still a couple more things that need to be taken care of. First off, I'm giving the tank a really good spray down. As this terrarium has ventilation and it's not airtight, it's going to need regular spraying. My best guess is that I'll be giving it a light spray down once or twice a week. These tiny bugs are known as springtails and they'll help keep the terrarium clean and healthy. They'll eat things like mould and decaying matter throughout the ecosystem and turn it into nutrients which the moss and plants can use to grow. Now, before introducing the creature that will call this terrarium home, I'm going to let the moss and plants grow in and establish. It's been 4 months since I set this tank up, and as I'm sure you can see, it really has been thriving. The moss and plants have grown in really well, with only a couple exceptions that didn't make it. The begonia I planted in the foreground melted away in the first couple weeks, and unfortunately it didn't bounce back. With that being the only exception, everything else is doing really well. The Photonia has grown some nice height, and the oak leaf creeping fig is climbing up the cork bark just like I hoped it would. A highlight for me is these stunning dark iridescent leaves from this begonia. With that said, it doesn't quite compare to the jewel orchid, which has grown several new leaves, each with beautiful coloration and detail. Before adding the inhabitant, I do want to take care of some maintenance. The Hygrophila has grown unbelievably well, and it's pushing up right at the top of the glass. I'm going to trim it back, as well as pulling out some of the begonia that has reached right to the top as well. With the maintenance taken care of, here's the creature that will call this terrarium home. This is a tiny orchid mantis. Don't be fooled by its stunning appearance, as this is a fierce predator, especially if you're an unsuspecting fruit fly. This one is absolutely adorable and so unbelievably tiny. I'm unsure of the gender at the moment, but as with most mantis species, the females grow much bigger than the males. I'm really not sure on a name, so I'd love to hear your suggestions in the comments below. Now it's time to introduce the mantis to its new home. It wasted no time at all and jumped straight inside. A few days have passed and the mantis has settled in really well. Here's some footage I got of it hunting and catching some fruit flies. It's truly amazing just how fast and precise they are, and I think it's safe to say that these fruit flies don't stand a chance. This terrarium has been an absolute joy to watch over the past 120 days, and it's only going to get better and better as the mantis grows and the plants continue to establish. It's crazy to think that this tank started as just a few picture frames, and now after 4 months it's turned into a thriving miniature ecosystem. Don't forget to leave your name suggestions in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching. In this video, I'm going to make a lush planted ecosystem for a tiny adorable tree frog. Be sure to stick around to the end, it's going to be a good one. Here's the glass tank that I'll be using. I built it myself and it measures 45 by 30 by 60. Shout out to Troy Goldberg, as I followed his tutorial to build this Euro-style vivarium. I'll put a link below so you can check it out. As regular viewers may know, I have had this tank set up before, but it's been a few years and I've learned a lot since then, so I think it's about time for a rescape. I thought I'd save you the hassle of watching me take it down and clean it all up. The tank has got 2 sliding doors with a vent along the top and another vent along the bottom for good airflow. To get started, I'm going to remove the glass doors and get to work on the background. What I'm going to use is some compressed cork panels. They're relatively inexpensive and not too hard to get hold of. I've never used them before, but I think they have the potential of looking really good. I've already cut down the back panel, so now I'm going to use a ruler to measure out the sides. I'm now placing it on the floor, marking out the length and cutting it down. I'll leave links to all the materials I use for this build in the description and in the pinned comment. When it comes to the background in a vivarium like this one, I always like it to be on the darker side, as I think it looks more natural. Obviously they'll be sitting higher on the glass, but they all fit in perfectly. Now I'm going to go ahead and secure them in place with some silicone. It's important to use 100% silicone or silicone that's advertised as fish or aquarium safe. With a generous amount of silicone on the glass, I can go ahead and place in the cork panel and press it down into place. I'm placing on some heavy objects and leaving it for about an hour or so. The silicone does take 24 hours to cure, but after an hour it's dried enough that I can move on to the next side. I'm going to repeat the same process until all 3 panels are fitted in place. It's the next day and the silicone is fully cured, so let's start talking about the hardscape. I've got this absolutely amazing piece of wood that I got from my local fish shop. I'm placing in a plastic tub which is roughly how high the substrate will go up to, and then getting a feel of how the wood looks in the tank. I don't know about you, but I really feel like it resembles an old ancient tree, so that's the look I'm going to go for. Now I know roughly where the wood is going to go, I want to make the background a little less flat and boring. I've cut up some leftover cork panels and I'm going to use them to add a little bit more depth and interest to the hardscape. For now, I'm temporarily attaching them in place with some toothpicks just to get a general idea of where I want them to go. Now I'm happy with their placement, let's get them locked down into place. What I'll be using is this Gorilla Glue. It forms an extremely strong bond, and once dry it's completely safe for live plants and animals. A light misting of water helps it cure, and it does expand, so you don't actually need to apply too much. With the pieces in, I'm going to place on some heavy rocks and then let it cure for a couple hours. I'll save you some time and get on with gluing the rest of the panels off camera. With everything glued in place, it's time to make the background look a bit more natural. I've got a drill with a wire brush on the end to do this. I'm tearing up the cork panel to give it more depth, texture and interest. You can do this by hand with a wire brush, some pliers and a knife, but it does take a lot more time. I'm making sure to go around the edges of the pieces I glued on and make them naturally taper onto the background. Once you're done, they shouldn't look like separate pieces that have been glued on. Before cleaning up the tank and taking it back inside, I'm going to collect up some of the cork panel shavings as they'll come in handy later. Here's the cork panels all carved down and I'm really happy with how it looks. It certainly doesn't have to be perfect, as a lot of it's going to be covered up with plants and a hardscape anyway. I've got a few small pieces of wood which I want to attach to the cork bark. These will add more detail and provide a place to mount plants onto later on. After experimenting with their placement, I'm going to glue them in place with the super glue and tissue method. I'm going to add multiple points of contact just to make sure it's nice and strong and not going to go anywhere. Now I'll glue this one on the right side and a few other pieces around the tank. With these pieces securely locked down, I want to take the hardscape to another level. I want to create the look of roots growing down over all the sides of the background. I'm not completely sure how it's going to turn out, but I think it has the potential of looking good, especially when the tank is planted. The wood I'm using to create this look is spiderwood branches. I'm really trying to make them intertwine with the hardscape as best as possible to try and create a natural looking ecosystem. A couple hours have passed and I've managed to get the left side and the back done. Despite it being an extremely tedious process, I'm absolutely loving how it's looking. Now, although the branches look like they're single pieces, they're actually made up of multiple smaller ones. Obviously, it would be much easier if they were single branches, but sometimes you've got to work with what you've got. I'm constantly trimming and gluing the branches to make them naturally lead into one another. It is time consuming, but I'm hoping the end result will be worth it. Here's all the branches in, and it's safe to say I'm really happy that I went ahead with this idea. What do you think? Is it too much, or do you think it will add to the natural look of the tank? Let me know in the comments. One thing that's certainly not looking natural is all the glue joints between the wood and the background. To cover up all the glue marks, I'm going to use some liquid type super glue and some of the shavings that I collected from the background earlier. I'm simply applying the glue on the area I want to cover up and then sprinkling on some shavings. After brushing off the excess, you can see that it creates a seamless and natural looking joint. I'll go ahead and repeat the same process until all the glue marks are covered up. I've taken the tank back outside and I'm giving it a really good spray down. After draining out the water and bringing it back inside, it's now time to get it in place on the rack. It's going to sit here in between the praying mantis tank and my dart frog vivarium. With it on the rack, it's finally time to move on with the build and get the drainage layer in. What I'll be using is this coarse filter foam. I'm taking some measurements and then cutting the foam down to size. The benefit of using this for the drainage layer is that it's extremely light in comparison to rocks and stones. If I ever needed to move the tank, using this makes it much easier. In a setup like this, it's extremely important that there's a way to drain water out from the drainage layer. This here is a quick and easy workaround to drilling a hole in the tank. At the bottom, I've cut slots which will allow water to flow into it. I'll then place it in the corner of the tank, and whenever I want to drain out the water, I'll place in some airline tubing and siphon it out. I've got the same setup on my Dart Frog tank, which is just past 3 years old and it's still working great. I do recommend placing a cork on the top to stop things like substrate and plant matter blocking up the hole. Now the drainage layer is complete, I can place in the substrate barrier. I'm using some window screen mesh, but some weed blocker fabric also works well. This layer will help prevent the substrate from getting down into the drainage layer. Next up, I'm going to add a layer of crushed charcoal. Now I don't usually do this as I have the charcoal in my substrate mix, but I thought for this build I'll add it anyway. The purpose of charcoal in an ecosystem like this one is to remove impurities from the water. Next up is the substrate. This is my Terrarium soil mix, which I use for pretty much all my builds. I'll put the components up on screen now, and I'll have links in the description as well. It holds moisture, is resistant to compression, provides nutrients for the plants, and it's well draining. I'm pouring in a generous amount and then gently compressing it down into place with my hand. With the substrate in, I can now place in the main hardscape element. I'm using a small piece of wood to help prop it up, which also looks like a root at the base. Now it's nice and stable, I'm going to add some more substrate in behind it. After adding a few final touches, here's the complete hardscape. I'm extremely happy with how it's turned out, and I think it makes a great skeleton that can be brought to life with plants. Talking about plants, let's get the planting started with these bromeliads. These are perfect for a tree frog setup, as the frogs love to take shelter in the leaves. These plants are epiphytes, so they don't need to be planted in the substrate and they can simply be mounted on the wood. I'm wedging the first one in behind the tree, and then I'm going to mount another on the right side. To hold it in place, I'm firstly going to apply some gel type superglue. Once dry, it can hold the plant up, but it certainly won't be strong enough to hold it once it's full of water. To ensure it doesn't fall off, I'm also going to wrap it with some thread. With time, it'll grow anchoring roots which will hold it in place. Now the bromeliads are in, let's move on to some climbing plants. This is a long cutting of McGravia syntenacea. I'm using some scissors to trim it up into multiple cuttings which I'll plant throughout the tank. As I said, this is a climbing plant, so I'm making sure to plant it in areas where it has room to climb up the background. I'm using some stainless steel staples to pin the plant down onto the cork panel. Next, I'm going to add some sphagnum moss underneath it, which will really help it root and start growing. These stem cuttings will send out new shoots around the top leaves, which will grow up the background. This can take some time, especially when plants are acclimating to a new setup. If you're enjoying this video so far, be sure to give it a like, as it does really help out. Next up, I've got another McGravia species which I propagated on this tree fern panel. Instead of pulling it off the panel and potentially damaging the plant, I'm just going to plant it as it is. I think these smaller McGravia cuttings will look really good growing up the base of the wood. I'm hoping they'll slowly grow and creep up the base and look like they do in my praying mantis terrarium. I really think this look will add a natural feel into the tank. Talking about this tank, some of the plants are getting a bit overgrown, so I'm going to take some cuttings and put them to use. This climbing plant is Solanum Ecuador, and it has these stunning brown tinted leaves. When using the staples to pin the plants down, I'm making sure to leave some wiggle room, as the last thing you want is to damage the stems. This next plant to go in is one of my favourites. This is Philodendron verrucosum. It's got these amazing green velvet leaves which do grow to a relatively good size. Once established, this plant will be one of the main features of this tank. I'm keeping the rhizome above the substrate and then covering the roots with some sphagnum moss. After giving the tank a good spray down, I'm going to plant this syngonium. It's not looking in the best shape, but I'm hoping it will recover and grow well in the tank. I'm planting the rhizome on some sphagnum moss and then using toothpicks to pin it down into place. Up next is another philodendron species, but this one will stay much smaller than the verrucosum. As I'm sure you can tell, I'm trying to use a wide variety of plants to make this tank look like a true natural ecosystem. In my opinion, a mix of leaf shape, size, texture and colour is always going to add to the natural look of a tank. This here is a small leafed climbing plant known as oak leaf creeping fig. I think it will add some really nice detail growing on the ancient looking tree. When planting plants away from the substrate, it's always a good idea to provide something that will hold moisture and help them grow. I always find that a small patch of sphagnum moss works great. Planting a tank like this does take a while, so I do like to give it a light spray down every now and then. I think some moss and plants growing up on top of this wooden branch will look really good. Same as before, I'm wedging in some sphagnum moss followed by a few cuttings of oak leaf creeping fig. Now this next planting method is a bit of an experiment, so I'm really not sure if it's going to work. I've wrapped the base of this ficus in some sphagnum moss and I'm going to wedge it in the top of the tank. I'm hoping this will help jumpstart the plants growing in and filling out the background. Before adding any moss to the tank, I firstly want to add some leaf litter. I'm starting by breaking up some Indian almond leaves. On top of the Indian almond leaves, I'm going to place in these mangrove leaves. I'm not breaking these ones up as I want them to look nice and natural. These leaves not only make the tank look extremely natural, but they also play a key role for the microfauna. Things like springtails and other small bugs will primarily use these leaves as their home and a source of food. I really want the base of the tank to look like a forest floor, so I'm going to go ahead and add some more detail. I'm using some thread to wrap some sphagnum moss around this small piece of driftwood. Now I'm going to take some Christmas moss and use some more thread to wrap it down onto the sphagnum. This is an aquatic species of moss that grows great in a setup like this. However, it really doesn't like to dry out, so adding the sphagnum moss really helps it retain moisture. I'll go ahead and cover some more pieces of driftwood using the same method. Now I can freely place them at the bottom of the tank to add a nice pop of green amongst the leaf litter. I'm going to place some more Christmas moss in a few select areas around the tank. This is mainly in areas where it can sit on top of some sphagnum moss and is less likely to dry out. With time, as the tank establishes, it will slowly creep and grow over the hardscape and background. The tank is now fully planted and I'm absolutely loving how it looks. Before I can leave it and let it establish, there's a few more things that I need to do first. Now I'm going to install the misting system. I've created this triple-headed misting output myself with some push fittings. It's not too difficult at all and much cheaper than buying it ready-made. Along with everything else, I'll have a link to the push fittings in the description. It's fully adjustable to point in any direction I want and it attaches to the top of the glass with some suction cups. Instead of having to drill a hole in the glass, I've simply made a small hole in the mesh vent which I'll sandwich between with some push fittings. I can then connect the other end, which leads to a pump that powers the misting system for both of these tanks. I've set the timer up to turn on twice a day for 15 seconds. Now you don't actually need a misting system and there's nothing wrong with doing it with a spray bottle, but I already had it set up, so I thought I might as well put it to use. I'm not putting the frog in yet, but some creatures that can go in now are the springtails. In a setup like this one, springtails truly are essential. These tiny bugs will eat things like mould and decaying matter. This food is then processed and pooped out in the form of fertiliser that the plants can use to grow. They'll also completely take care of the frog poop, so I actually never need to clean this tank. To introduce them to this ecosystem, I'm gently pulling back the leaf litter and pouring them underneath. This is where they'll spend the majority of their time. Now before introducing Grogu the tree frog to his new home, I'm going to put the sliding doors back on and let this ecosystem grow in and establish for a couple months. Four months have passed and this vivarium has grown into a lush slice of nature. For the most part, it's been absolutely thriving and I think the plants truly speak for themselves. I have made a few additions which I'll talk about shortly. Unfortunately, the syngonium I planted at the base didn't make it, but I decided to replace it with this stunning peperomia. I'm almost glad that this happened as I absolutely love how this plant looks growing at the base of the tank. Another addition is this fine-leafed green plant known as Leliopsis. I only planted a couple patches and it sent out runners which are slowly creeping around the tank. My favourite new addition has got to be this begonia. Its leaves are stunning and it does great in low light, making it perfect for the shaded areas of this tank. What other plants would you add, as I'm open to suggestions? Let me know in the comments. Although it's hard to see, the McGravia cuttings are slowly creeping up the ancient tree. An honourable mention has got to be the new growth on this McGravia umbellata red. I can't wait to see it climb all the way to the top of the background. Now I can't talk about plant growth without taking a look at the absolutely breathtaking Philodendron verrucosum. This plant is truly the centrepiece of the tank and I couldn't be happier with how it's doing. As for the Christmas moss planted around the tank, it's doing just as well as I hoped it would. It's growing nice and compact and slowly spreading over the hardscape. Not every plant has been thriving in this setup. The experimental planting of the ficus didn't seem to work out at first, but it seems like there's some new growth coming, so I've got my fingers crossed. That's why I love setups like this, as you can try new things and find out what works. Without further ado, it's finally time to introduce Grogu to his new tank. He's a male hourglass tree frog and I've had him for about 3.5 years. Compared to other species of tree frogs, he's absolutely tiny, so this tank will be a mansion for him. I am thinking about finding him a lady friend and even trying to get them to breed so we can have even more tiny adorable frogs. Let me know if this is something you'll be interested in seeing on the channel. He really doesn't want to get off the leaf and he's just sitting there admiring this ecosystem that he can call home. Instead of forcing him off, I'm going to place the leaf at the base of the tank and let him start exploring in his own time. As for his diet, I'll be feeding him a mix of fruit flies and small crickets. I should mention that I have set up a low-powered UVB light that shines through the mesh at the top. Now I'm going to get the sliding doors back on just in time for the rain. If you've got time, I'd love to hear your opinions on this ecosystem in the comments below. Whether that's things you'd do differently or plants you'd add, I'm all ears. I really appreciate you making it to the end of this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe as it really helps out, and as always, thank you for watching. In this video, I'll show you how to make a no-filter mini indoor pond for some tiny cherry shrimp. Be sure to stick around to the end as something truly amazing happens 90 days in. Here's the tank that I'll be using. I built it myself from an old aquarium. I'll put a link to a similar sized tank in the description. It's already got a foam mat on the bottom, so let's get straight into the idea that I've got for this setup. I want to have a nice tall structure on the left side with lots of immersed plants growing around it. This will leave a really good water volume for the shrimp, which I think they'll appreciate. To build the hardscape, I've got a selection of driftwood and cereal stones. I think the contrast between these two has the potential of creating a really nice natural looking scape. As always, I leave a good amount of time to experiment with multiple different layouts and structures until I find something I'm happy with. In this case, it didn't take too long and I really like how these two pieces come together to look like the base of a tree. To make things a whole lot easier, I'm going to lock these two pieces together. This is super easy to do by wedging some tissue between the contact points and then soaking it in some liquid type superglue. It dries really quickly and forms a strong bond that is completely safe for the shrimp. I always like to add a couple more contact points just to make sure that they don't come apart in the future. Now this piece is really solid, I can place it in the tank and move on with the hardscape. I'm not pushing it all the way towards the back as I do want some substrate and plants to go behind it. Now I can take the stones and start placing them inside. Same as the wood, it's a case of trial and error and finding out which stones fit and look good together. I need to try and arrange them to create a retaining wall which will stop the substrate that will sit behind the driftwood from rolling down into the water. Here's what I've come up with so far. I'm really liking how it's looking, but it's getting hard to build any more as I keep on knocking everything over. Same as I did with the wood, I'm going to lock everything down in place with the superglue and tissue method. This will not only make building the scape much easier, but it'll also mean when doing maintenance in the future, I haven't got to worry about completely destroying the hardscape. Here's the hardscape all locked together and it's even strong enough to be taken out as one entire piece. I think it looks great inside the tank and there's still plenty of room in behind the driftwood for the immersed plants. Now I'm going to take some fine filter floss and plug the holes throughout the retaining wall. It is important to do this because if you don't, the substrate will leak through these holes onto the sand and it certainly won't look too good. You might be thinking that the white filter wall is a bit of an eyesore, but you won't be able to see it by the end as it's super easy to hide with moss and plants. With all the holes plugged in, I can now move on and start making the pond look much more natural. I'm starting with a layer of fine sand. A paintbrush comes in handy to spread the sand out throughout the scape. I think this small piece of cereal stone looks good as an island in the middle of the sand. To make the transition from the sand up to the hardscape look more natural, I'm going to add some of these small stones. I'm not overthinking their placement too much, but as a good rule of thumb, there should be more around the base of the rocks, with there being less and less as it goes out into the open sand. To tie everything together, I've got some fine gravel which I'll sprinkle on top. In my opinion, I think the combination of these materials really makes the scape look a lot more natural. To improve the detail and interest even more, I'm going to add some small spiderwood branches. I'm going to place these at the base of the driftwood to look like roots growing down over the rocks. Once I'm happy with their placement, I'll use some gel type superglue to lock them down. I should mention I'll list all the materials I've used for this build in the description below, along with some links in case you want to try making something like this yourself. I'm extremely happy with how the hardscapes turned out, and I love the detail that the small twigs bring. What I'm going to do now is fill in the space behind the hardscape with substrate. Aqua soil is going to be perfect for this as it holds a good amount of nutrients and it's not going to stagnate from sitting in still water. Before adding any plants, I'm giving the entire scape a good spray down. To kick off the planting, I've got some Anubias and Bucephalandra. I'm preparing them by taking them out the pots and removing all the rock wool before planting. You can plant them as they are, but I like to split them up into a few different sections. As these plants are epiphytes, all I'm going to do to plant them is wedge them in gaps and cracks throughout the scape. They grow great both under and above the water, so I'm planting them accordingly. I think some Anubias growing on this small rock will be a nice addition. As there's no gaps to wedge it into, I'm using a small amount of gel type superglue to mount it to the rock. Even with just a few plants in, I'm loving how this mini pond has sprung to life and is starting to take shape. These plants really don't like drying out, so it's important to give them a light spray down every now and then. Next up, I've got a plant which I think will help take this scape to the next level. These are asparagus ferns, and my favourite thing about them is that they resemble small miniature trees. I'm using some long tweezers to dig a hole down into the aqua soil and then planting them inside. I'm really hoping that they thrive in this setup. Next, I want to plant some hydrocotyle to grow right at the water's edge. I'm hoping this will fill out some space and have some nice dense growth. As this is a no filter setup, I'll be relying on the plants to clean the water and act as the filter. This here is some Alternanthera mini. Under good lighting, it has some really nice vibrant red leaves. It is an aquatic plant, but I have grown it great inside terrariums. I'm not sure how it's going to do in this setup, as I'm going to try and grow it in the open air. It might die off due to lack of humidity, but I'd say it's worth a try. Now the planting's complete, I'm absolutely loving how this mini indoor pond is looking. I think it's about time I fill it up with water. I've placed in some bubble wrap to help disperse the water and stop it from disrupting the scape. All I'm using for this setup is some dechlorinated tap water. This certainly wouldn't be a mini pond without some floating plants. I'm placing in a few different species to add some nice detail and contrast to the surface of the water. Their fast growth will also help balance the pond's mini ecosystem. Just over 4 weeks have passed and the mini pond is thriving. For the most part, all the plants are growing in really well and I've had no problems with algae whatsoever. The only change I've made is replacing the Alternanthera with some Photonia as it started to struggle due to lack of humidity. A couple weeks ago I did introduce some small snails into the water, but I think it's about time that I add even more life. I'm introducing a small group of red cherry shrimp which will call this pond their home. If conditions are perfect, they'll end up breeding, which will be great to see. It's only been 3 weeks since I introduced the shrimp and something amazing has happened. There's not one, but 2 females carrying loads of tiny eggs. Fingers crossed they stay healthy and develop into loads of baby shrimp. The mini pond is doing great, as are the shrimp. The females are still carrying the eggs just as they should be. The small black dots on the eggs are actually the eyes of the baby shrimp. This really is great to see, and hopefully they'll be hatching in no time at all. Here we are 3 months later after setting up this mini pond ecosystem. It's been an absolute joy to watch it grow and evolve over the past 90 days. Before taking a look inside the water, let's talk about some of the plants. The floating plants have got to be one of the highlights for me. I think the variety and species really adds to the natural look of the tank. The hydrocotyle is doing exceptionally well, and it's even sent some runners over the glass on the outside of the pond. I love how they look, so I certainly won't be cutting them back. The Photonia did die off slightly as it acclimated, but it seems to have bounced back strong with these vibrant pink leaves. One change you've probably noticed is in the asparagus fern behind the driftwood. The original fern unfortunately started to die off, so I switched it with this. This could have been for a number of reasons, but my best guess is that it struggled to acclimate to the humidity as I pulled it out a very humid setup. Now let's take a look into the water, as there's some really exciting things going on inside. At first glance you can't really see much other than the adult shrimp, but as you look a bit closer a whole nother world opens up. The eggs the female were carrying have finally hatched, and here are the babies. They're no more than 12 hours old and only a couple millimeters in size. In this shot here you can really get an idea of just how tiny they are. On the left is one of the adults, and it looks like an absolute giant in comparison. As I look around the tank I can see more and more of them. They seem to especially like hiding out in the roots of the floating plants. It goes without saying that this setup isn't going to be big enough for all these shrimp as they start to grow up. Luckily for them, I've got a giant ecosystem in need of some shrimp. This is a future build coming out on the channel, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Thank you for making it all the way to the end. I'd love to hear what you think of this build in the comments below. In this video, I'm going to make a terrarium with a working stream that flows down into a mini relaxing pond. Let's get straight into the build. I'm going to start right at the beginning by building the glass tank. Now you might think that building the glass tank is going to be really complex and difficult, but trust me when I say it's not. What I've got here is some frameless glass picture frames, and this is what I'll be using to build the tank. They're cheap to get hold of and really quite easy to cut. The thickness of the glass is just over 2mm. Some picture frames come with 1mm glass. Try and steer clear of these as it's really quite thin and hard to work with. Now I'm going to save myself some work and use the largest piece as the back panel without cutting it whatsoever. To cut the other pieces, here's what you're going to need. Firstly, you're going to need a ruler. What I like to do is place on a few patches of sticky tack to the underside and squish it down so it's pretty much flat. This really gives the ruler some traction and stops it from moving around when cutting the glass, so you get nice straight cuts. You'll also need a marker pen and obviously a glass cutter. When I first heard about cutting glass, I always thought you'll need some big machines to do it properly, but that's not the case. Simple tools like these is all you need. I'll do my best to leave links to all the tools and materials that I'll be using for this build in the description. To start off, I'm marking the glass to the size I want to cut it. Now I'm lining the ruler up and making sure it's as straight as possible. With the glass cutter, I'm firmly pushing down into the glass and pulling it back in one continuous movement. It's important that you don't go over the cut more than once, as this will blunten the tip of the glass cutter. Now as you can see, there's a nice straight score going down the glass. All I'm going to do now is take it to a straight edge and give it a few gentle taps along this straight line. It breaks in half with ease and I'm left with a perfect straight cut. I will be sanding the glass later, but it's important to be careful at this point as it is really quite sharp. I know a lot of people are worried about cutting glass and it can seem quite intimidating. Believe me, you'll be surprised and it's much easier than you might think. Get hold of some picture frames and start practicing. You'll certainly screw up, as do I, but you'll get there in no time. If you don't like the thought of breaking the glass by hitting it on a straight edge, here's an easy alternative. Take a straight wooden skewer and place it under the score line. All you've got to do then is hold one side down whilst gently pressing the other. It snaps in half with ease. This here is the panel for the top of the tank. I'm going to cut off a small section of the corner. This will allow a USB cord from a pump to be fed through. I used the ruler as leverage to get a nice clean break. Before going any further, what I like to do is a quick test fit of all the pieces. In the past, I've cut all the pieces out, spent a lot of time sanding them down only to find out that I've made a mistake. Obviously the glass is sharp, so it's got to be assembled with care. A good tip is to use electrical tape as it doesn't leave any residue on the glass like some other tapes will. All the pieces fit together perfectly, so it's time to get to work sanding. As I'm using picture frame glass for this build, the only edges that need to be sanded are the ones that I cut. The factory edges from the frames are already really smooth. This is really handy as on most pieces I only need to sand one out of the 4 sides. When sanding glass, make sure that the sandpaper is wet. This stops any glass dust, which is something you definitely don't want to be breathing in. With all the pieces sanded and dried, it's time to start assembling. I'm using some clear aquarium grade silicone. When it comes to the thickness of the silicone bead, it should be no thinner than the thickness of the glass. I like to make it a little bit thicker just to be safe. As you can see, I've already got all the electrical tape ready to lock everything in place. With the back and side panels in, I'm going to add a secondary bead of silicone on the inner seam of the glass. I'm then using my finger to smoothen it out and remove the excess. Adding this secondary bead really helps ensure that there's no leaks. 24 hours have passed and the silicone is fully cured. Before cleaning up the imperfections, I'm firstly going to add the hinged front door. I'm going to show you how to make a strong, seamless joint that allows the door to hinge open at the front. To start off, I'm placing some electrical tape on either side to make sure the door stays in place. Now I'm going to place on 2 strips of masking tape. The first strip is going along the front, flush with the top of the door. The second strip is going along the top of the tank with a small gap being left. It's very important to leave the small gap, as without it the hinge door won't work. There should be the top of the door visible and a portion of the top panel glass visible. Now I'm applying a small bead of silicone along the gap. Next, with my finger, I'm gently spreading out the silicone to make sure that it's in contact with all the glass. It's important not to press down too hard as you don't really want to be taking much of the silicone off. What I like to do next is take a straight edge like this ruler and gently smoothen out the silicone. Once again, you don't want to be scraping it off, but instead just gently gliding the ruler over the top. This really does make it look much more professional. Now the last thing to do is to take the masking tape off whilst the silicone is still wet. With the tape out the way, you can now see that there is some thickness to the silicone, which is why it's so strong. 24 hours have passed, so now it's time to remove the tape holding the door in place and see how it works. It's working really well, and it's even flexible enough for the door to be folded over onto the top panel. This is really convenient for building the terrarium and maintenance. When closed, there's no gaps whatsoever and it actually stays closed really well. I've been making these hinged silicone doors for a good while now, and the most common question I get is about the strength of the silicone. To some people's surprise, the silicone is actually extremely strong, and in this case I can hold the entire weight of the tank just by the door. To further show its strength, I'm pulling on the glass door and you can actually see the top panel of glass bending. Considering the glass door is extremely light, I'm not worried about the silicone failing whatsoever. With the door complete, all that's left to do now is to finish up the tank by cleaning up the imperfections. I'm just using a sharp blade to cut off the excess silicone. Here's the tank fully complete. It's only cost me about £10 to make and I'm really happy with it. Before building, there's a couple more things that need to be done. I'm attaching a foam mat to the bottom to protect the glass against uneven surfaces, and then I'm going to do a quick water test. I've said this in previous videos, but I'll say it again. Water testing the tank is essential, as the last thing you want is to find a leak once the build is fully complete. I've left it for over a day and there's no leaks, so it's finally time to start building the terrarium. To start off, it's going to need a drainage layer. For this build, I think the perfect material to use is going to be some coarse filter foam. I'm placing it under the tank and then using a sharp blade to trace around it. Now I can clearly see the lines. I'm going to go ahead and use some scissors to cut it out. It fits nice and snug inside the tank. In a tank like this, a filter foam drainage layer is perfect as it's extremely light and it will also allow water to freely pass through it. Now let me quickly tell you about my plan for this build. I want to make a slow trickling stream that flows down all the way from the right side of the tank into a pond on the left side. I'm going to start off by making the pond, and for that I'm going to use this smoothie cup lid. It really does look quite ridiculous at the moment, but fingers crossed my plan will work out. With a sharp blade I'm cutting a hole out for the pond to sit into. This really doesn't have to be neat whatsoever. I'm continuing to take more foam out until I'm happy with how it sits. This here should be about right. You probably noticed that it is sticking out quite a lot, and that's because I have got to account for the substrate as well. With some scissors I'm cutting out a small slot, which is where the stream will enter the pond. Now let's get to work making the pond look a little bit more natural. To start off, I'm going to use some sandpaper to roughen up the smooth surface of the plastic. The reason I'm doing this is that I'm going to cover the entire inside of the cup in silicone, and this will help it stick much better. Obviously, the massive hole in the bottom needs to be covered up. I'm placing in a few patches of tape to cover up the hole. The tape is only acting as a bridge for the silicone that I'm going to use to seal everything. I've got some black aquarium silicone as well as some crushed lava rock. I've got some larger pieces as well as some really fine dust. I'm applying the silicone in small patches and then using my finger to spread it out. I'm then taking the larger pieces of lava rock, sprinkling them inside, followed by the fine dust. All I've got to do now is press it down into the silicone and pour off the excess. It covers up the plastic really well and looks much more natural. I'm going to continue the same process until the entire inside of the cup is complete. Here it is with everything covered and dried after 24 hours. You will also notice that I have added another layer of silicone on the bottom to sandwich in the hole so there's no leaks. Now let's get to work making the stream that flows into the pond. I've got some leftover pieces of filter foam which I'm going to use to build some height. As you see, they gradually get shorter and shorter as they make their way to the pond. To make the stream, what I'm going to use is some expanding foam. Before applying the foam, I'm going to place in some cling film on the inside of the tank. This will stop the expanding foam sticking to the filter foam, and it will mean I can remove it once it's dry. Now I'm applying the foam in the shape that I want the stream. I'm trying not to use too much as I know how much it can expand. After leaving it for a good few hours, it's pretty much fully dried. I can now get rid of the cling film and start carving the foam down. One thing I'm going to do before carving down the foam is use a Sharpie to make a rough guide of the shape of the stream. It hasn't got to be neat whatsoever, but it will give me a rough guideline to follow. Some time has passed and I've pretty much got the stream fully carved down. It really does look quite ridiculous at the moment, but trust me, it should start taking shape soon. Some parts are really quite fragile and flimsy, so I'm using some wooden toothpicks to add some support. When placing it in the tank, you can see the natural slope the water will flow down into the pond. As I'm sure you can see, there's plenty of holes that need to be patched up, so I'm going to start doing that now. I'm placing in a small piece of tissue and then pressing it down into place. Next, I'm going to soak it in some liquid type superglue. The tissue absorbs the glue and dries rock solid in no time at all. Once dried, the glue is inert, making it 100% safe for terrariums. Next, I'm going to patch up this larger hole at the bottom of the stream. I'm using the exact same method as I previously did. The glue and tissue can sometimes cause a reaction, so make sure you're doing it in a well ventilated place or wearing a mask. Now all the large holes have been patched up, it's time to start making the stream look more natural. I'm going to do this with the same method that I done for the pond, using some black silicone and crushed lava rock. I'm applying this silicone in a small area and then using my finger to spread it out and try and get it in all the gaps and cracks. Then all I've got to do is sprinkle on some crushed lava rock, press it down into place and remove the excess. Now I'm going to repeat the same process until the entire stream is covered. Here's the stream fully covered and left to dry for 24 hours. I'm really liking how it looks and the tank is finally starting to take shape. What I'm going to do now is work on installing the pump. This is a small USB aquarium pump that has an adjustable flow. I want it to sit right in the corner. I'm pulling out the filter foam drainage and cutting a small section where the pump can sit in. I'm also placing in a small piece for it to sit on top of. Now let's work on the output that leads to the top of the stream. I've got a small section of 6mm tubing that fits nicely inside the pump. Next I'm going to place on this 90-degree push fitting. I'm then cutting a slit down the foam for it all to sit into. After placing the stream back in, I've measured and cut another piece of 6mm tube into the correct height. I can then connect it to the push fitting and it should be complete. The only way to find out if it works properly is to give it a test run. It's flowing well, but definitely a bit stronger than I would like. My vision was to have a slow moving, trickling stream and not a fast flowing one, so I'm going to try and fix that now. After a lot of trial and error, I've finally managed to get it flowing just right. As you can see, there's really not much water coming out at all, but I think it works for this terrarium really well. The only way I got this to work properly was by adding a T-push fitting. The majority of the water continues straight back into the drainage with a small amount going up towards the stream. The next thing I need to do is actually join the pond to the stream. I'm placing a small piece of tissue between the two and then soaking it in super glue. It locks the stream and pond together really well and can easily be hidden with some more crushed lava rock. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is the purpose of this small hole here. This is where water would drain from the pond to make sure that it doesn't overflow. Now let's finally start installing everything for the final time. I'm feeding the USB cable through the gap I left at the top of the tank. Now I'm taking some filter foam and covering up the pump. This will stop things like substrate from getting down to the intake. I'm now reinstalling the pond and stream and placing in some more filter foam to act as supports. Now it's time for the substrate. For this build I'm going to use some aqua soil. It contains a good amount of nutrients and has no problem with water constantly running through it. Regular terrarium substrate won't be suitable for this build as it's going to be extremely saturated, which it simply doesn't do well with. After pouring in a decent amount, I've spread it out and given it a light spray down. The output of the pump really doesn't look too good, so I'm going to cover that up before moving on. This is easy enough to do by gluing on some small pieces of lava rock. Now the output's covered up, I'm going to add a couple pieces of spiderwood to make the hardscape look a bit more natural. I'm experimenting with their position before locking them down in place. Now I'm happy, I'm using the super glue and tissue to attach it to the rocks. You don't have to glue the wood down, but I do find it makes planting and maintenance much easier as you haven't got to worry about knocking the hardscape over. I'm really happy with the final hardscape, but it's about to get even better as it's time for the plants. This is an aquatic fern that I've never used before, but I've heard that it does do well in terrarium conditions. After removing all the rock wool, I'm going ahead and planting it inside the tank. When I say planting, it's more wedging it in gaps, as this plant is an epiphyte and it'll rot if you plant it in the substrate. Next up, I've got some hygrophila. I really like this plant and I think it will bring a nice jungle feel to the tank. I'm chopping the stems in half so I have double the amount of plants to use. The top half will grow new roots in no time and the bottom half already has a new shoot coming through. This is an easy way to get more plants than what you paid for. With most of the stems cut in half, I'm using some long tweezers to plant them down into the substrate. It's really important not to let the plants dry out, so I'm giving them a light spray down every now and then. Next up, I've got this Anubias which has some stunning arrow-shaped leaves. I was originally going to plant it on the right side, but I think it looks much better over here on the left. I'm using a small amount of gel type glue to mount it to the spiderwood. Even with just these plants in, the terrarium's already sprung to life. In this gap where the stream flows round, I want there to be a nice pop of colour. I think this Alternanthera Mini is the perfect choice. It's a bit browny green at the moment, but once it establishes, it'll be a nice vibrant red. I've washed off the nutrient-rich gel and now I'm planting it down into the substrate. This here is some Monte Carlo and I want it to create a lush green carpet throughout the terrarium. I've once again washed out the nutrient-rich gel and I'm now splitting it up into smaller pieces. I can now start planting it into the aquasoil. With time, it will grow and spread and all the gaps should fill in nicely. To add some more contrast in the planting, I've got some small crypts and some Anubias and Bucephalandra. I'm mainly planting them in areas that I want to bring a little bit more detail to. With the planting almost complete, I'm going to add a couple patches of Christmas moss here and there. I'm really liking how this tank's looking after the planting, so let's get it filled up with water and turn on the stream. It's amazing to finally see the water trickling down the stream and slowly filling up the pond. I'm using some tubing to siphon out the water along with all the aquasoil I spilt in the pond. Now it's filled back up, I'm going to add some floating plants. I absolutely love the miniature scale they bring to the pond and the rest of the tank. Now it's time to add some springtails. These tiny bugs will eat things like mould and decaying matter throughout the terrarium. They're even more important in a tank like this as I used a good amount of spiderwood, which is always prone to growing mould in the first few weeks. With the tank complete, all that's left to do now is to let everything grow in and establish. Two months have passed and it's really quite amazing how well this terrarium is doing. All the plants have grown in and established really well and there's been little to no die-off whatsoever. My favourite has got to be this Monte Carlo, which has grown into a big soft cushion. You can also get a glimpse of the healthy root system that it sent out. Another plant that is doing really well is the Alternanthera mini. It's gone from this to this in just 8 weeks and it's really added that pop of colour that I was looking for. The stream is still flowing perfectly and I often find myself watching it slowly trickling down through all the plants. As we get to the pond, it's still functioning just as I hoped it would and the Monte Carlo makes it look even more natural with it growing around the edge. The floating plants do grow relatively fast, so I do have to remove them every now and then, but this is easy enough done with a fork. Another worthwhile mention is this new Anubias leaf, which is absolutely stunning. The plants in the background have still got some growing to do, but until then I'm going to sit back and enjoy watching the stream trickle down through the scape into the pond. If you enjoyed this video, you're probably going to enjoy this one where I make a flowing waterfall paludarium. In this video, I'll show you how to make a shrimp ecosystem inside a glass jar. It's super easy to care for, making it perfect for beginners, and it doesn't even need a filter. Now let's get straight into the build, it's going to be a good one. For the lighting, I'm using this LED display light which has a nice wooden base at the bottom. It's relatively low powered, making it perfect for a low tech and low maintenance setup like this one. The glass jar is roughly 5 litres, which is just over 1 US gallon. I've already attached a foam mat to the bottom to ensure that it sits nice and level. I want to keep this setup really low budget with materials that are super easy to source. This here is some garden topsoil. This will go right at the base of the ecosystem and will be the source of nutrients for all the plants inside. You really don't need too much, especially in a small setup like this one. I'll put a list of all the materials and plants used in this build in the description below along with some links. All I'm doing now is using my hand to flatten it out and make a nice even layer. It really doesn't look like much is in there, but this would be more than enough. I'm now going to completely soak it in water so there'll be no air bubbles trapped down in the substrate. This layer needs to be capped off, otherwise the nutrients will leach out into the water column, which will certainly cause algae issues. To do this, all I'm using is some fine aquarium gravel. You want this layer to be at least a couple centimeters thick. I've run out of gravel, but some coarse sand is going to work just as well. I'm sloping up the gravel towards the back as this will help create a nice sense of depth inside the jar. Now it's time for the hardscape. I've got this nice piece of driftwood which I think has the potential to look good inside this setup. With it inside the jar, it does seem a little bit too big for this setup, so I'm going to go ahead and chop it down. It fits in a lot better, but I'm not loving how it looks and I do feel like it takes up a bit too much ground space for the plants. Instead, I'm going to try out this spiderwood branch with some trident fern mounted on it. I've had this piece in a setup before, so it's nice and established. Instantly, I think it looks a lot better and much more suiting to the small jar. To give it a bit more height and stability inside the setup, I'm going to attach a rock to the base. This will also ensure that it won't float up once the jar is filled with water. I'll attach the rock to the wood using the superglue and tissue method. Don't worry, this method is 100% shrimp safe. Now the glue's dry, I can place the wood back inside the jar and press the rock down into the gravel to make it nice and stable. I've done the same with another piece of spiderwood which will branch out to the right side of the scape. I love the simplicity of this scape and the fact that there's so much ground space for plants, as that's essential in a no-filter ecosystem like this one. I think the foreground of the scape will look nicer with some decorative gravel. This gravel is in no way essential to the scape, but I really like how it looks and think it'll add some nice detail to the foreground. I'm doing my best to spread the gravel out with some long tweezers and then finishing it off with some fine gravel from before. Once these stones are wet, they have some really nice natural colours to them. For the background, I've got 2 pots of Limnophila. This plant is super easy to grow and has some nice bushy leaves which will fill up the background nicely. I've taken them out the pots, removed all the rock wool and split them up into 4 even bundles. I can now take some long tweezers and plant them down into the gravel. I am planting them relatively deep just so they don't float up and they're closer to the nutrients at the base. This is a fast growing plant, so it's going to do a lot of the work in keeping this ecosystem nice and clean. That being said, I am going to have to keep on top of maintenance as I don't want it overgrowing the entire setup. It's already starting to look like a slice of nature, but there's still plenty of plants to come. I think this crypt will act as a nice centerpiece plant. I'm going to plant it just in front of the spiderwood. I'm digging a small hole with the tweezers and then planting the roots down inside. This plant has been grown out of water, so its appearance will change as it adapts to underwater life. I think this Leliopsis will look nice on the left and right side of the scape. With time, hopefully it will send out runners into the foreground. I'm purposely using plants with different shape, colour, size and texture to hopefully add to the natural look of this aquarium. I'm really liking how it's looking so far, but I think some Bucephalandra is going to make it look even better. I've got a couple different species that will add some nice detail to the scape. I'm using a small amount of gel type superglue to mount it down in place. I think some smaller Nubius is also a great addition. Now the planting's complete, this nano aquarium is really taking shape. It's about time this jar gets filled up with water. A small piece of bubble wrap helps disperse the water and stops it from destroying the scape. I often get questions about what water I use for my scapes, and the answer is just regular tap water. Obviously I make sure it's dechlorinated, but that's all there is to it. It's great to see the jar finally filled up with water. Before I can add any inhabitants, the underwater ecosystem needs to be left to establish. It's only been 8 days since I set up this ecosystem jar and it's already looking a whole lot better. Despite there being no filter, there's been no problems with algae or water quality whatsoever. This is a great sign that the plants are doing their job in filtering the water and keeping it nice and clean. As I'm sure you can see, the Limnophila has grown right to the surface, so I'm going to give it a quick trim back. I'll replant these stems after doing a 20% water change. This is the first water change I've done, and I probably won't do another one for another couple weeks. In a no filter setup like this one, I've found it better to do less frequent water changes. This makes the parameters consistent and keeps the ecosystem balanced. That being said, I still like to test the water multiple times a week just to make sure everything's good. Now let's introduce the first inhabitants to this ecosystem. I've got a small group of these tiny snails. They won't really get any bigger than this, and they'll feed on things like algae growing inside the jar. This one landed upside down, but it soon pulled itself upright and started exploring. It's great to see some life in this jar, but I do want to let it establish a little bit longer before introducing any more. The ecosystem jar is now 50 days old, and I'm glad to say that it's thriving. I've done 3 water changes in that time, and the jar has been receiving 10 hours of light a day. All the plants have grown in really well, and they've been keeping the water quality perfect with no algae in sight. The roots of the plants have found their way down to the nutrient layer, which is a big reason for that. A few weeks ago, I added a small group of cherry shrimp to call this ecosystem their home. Let's see how they're doing. They've really been thriving in this setup, and their vibrant red colour really helps them stand out amongst the green plants. They do seem a bit camera shy and swim off as soon as I press record. Upon closer inspection, there's even a few tiny babies roaming throughout the jar. It's always great to see this, as breeding is a sign of a healthy ecosystem. If their population grows too much, I will take some out, as I don't want food to become scarce. So far, I haven't put any food inside the ecosystem, and they've simply been thriving off the biofilm that grows inside. This also goes for the tiny snails, which, as you can see, they've been working hard to keep the glass nice and clean. If you're interested in seeing detailed updates on my ecosystems, be sure to check out my weekly newsletter, Wednesday Updates. It also contains behind the scenes look at upcoming projects, and best of all, it's completely free. I'll put a link in the description so you can check it out. I really hope you found this video useful, and if you've never tried making something like this before, I highly recommend you give it a go. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a terrarium ecosystem for some beautiful and amazing creatures, and I'll even be adding a deadly apex predator. Be sure to stick around to the end, it's going to be a good one. To build the ecosystem in, I'm using this glass bowl. Obviously, it's going to need a lid on the top, but I'll address that at the end. To get started, I first need to work on the drainage layer. To make this layer, you've got many options, and I'll show you a few examples. This here is pea gravel. It's easy and cheap to get hold of, and it works great as a drainage layer. The only downside is that it is quite heavy, and in larger terrariums the weight certainly adds up. Fine aquarium gravel is also a great option. You can get it in loads of different colours, so if you want the drainage to stand out and pop, it's definitely the one for you. If you're on a budget, you can even use rocks from outside. Just make sure that you wash them off before using them and that they're not too big. All these options will work great, but my go-to material is Leaker. It is slightly more expensive than some of the other options, but I'd say it's worth it. It's super lightweight and porous, making it perfect for drainage. Now, in case you didn't know, the purpose of a drainage layer is to hold excess water inside the terrarium ecosystem. Without a drainage layer, excess water will sit in the substrate and quickly cause it to stagnate. This is certainly not ideal, and it will almost always result in the end of the terrarium's life. With that being said, you can get away without a drainage layer in smaller terrariums, but for one this size, I'd always put one in place. It really doesn't need to be too deep, and just an inch or so would do. Although the drainage layer is now complete, if I was to pour the substrate in now, it would simply fall through all the gaps between the stones. This example shows you how easy it will get through. Now, you're never going to be able to keep the drainage completely free of substrate, but there's something you can do which will certainly help. This here is window screen mesh, and I'm going to use it to act as a substrate barrier. It's fine enough to prevent the substrate from getting down to the drainage while still allowing water to freely pass through. I should mention I'll leave links to this and all the other materials I'll be using in case you want to try something like this yourself. It's a good idea to cut it slightly larger than it needs to be, as it will really help hold the substrate in place. With the substrate barrier in place, let's move on to creating the terrarium substrate mix. I'm going to show you how to make this substrate, which I use for pretty much all of my terrariums. Firstly, you're going to need a tub to measure out the parts and a tub to mix everything up in. To start off, I'm going to measure out 2 parts of sphagnum moss. I often get asked how to measure in parts, so let me quickly explain. 1 part is simply the total volume of the tub that you choose to use. In this case, I need 2 parts sphagnum moss, so I'm filling up the tub twice and pouring it into the mixing tub. For example, if I needed 1 part, it will only be 1 tub, or if I needed half a part, it'll only be half of the tub. Next in the recipe is the cocoa fibre. I rehydrated a cocoa fibre brick earlier, ready to be used. You're only going to need 1 part cocoa fibre. Next up is 1/4 part orchid bark. If you can't get hold of orchid bark, most small bark chips work great as an alternative. Next is 1/4 part crushed charcoal followed by 1/4 part worm castings. Once mixed up, all these components come together to make the perfect terrarium substrate. It holds moisture, is resistant to compression, provides nutrients for the plants, and it's well draining. These 4 things are key characteristics of a quality terrarium substrate. With the substrate complete, it's now time to start pouring it inside the ecosystem. I'm adding a generous amount and then gently spreading it out and pressing it down into place with the back of my hand. Now the substrate's in, it's time for my favourite part, which is the hardscape. I'm going to use this piece of spiderwood, which in my opinion resembles an old tree stump with exposed roots. After a bit of experimentation, I like how it looks over on the right side, but I do want to build the substrate up a little bit higher. When creating a hardscape, it's all about trial and error and coming up with a layout you like and are happy with. After all, it's your terrarium, so if you like how it looks, then you've done a good job. I'm loving how this spiderwood is looking inside the terrarium, but I do feel like it's a bit empty on the left side, so I'm going to add another piece. Now the spiderwood's in, I want to place in a few rocks to add a bit of contrast. This here is black lava rock, and I think it'll be perfect for this terrarium. All I'm going to do is place them in and around the spiderwood to add some contrast. I must say they do blend in quite a lot at the moment, but once the moss and plants are in, these black rocks will stand out nicely. I absolutely love how this hardscape's turned out, but now it's time to bring it to life with moss and plants. The first thing I want to do is add a carpet of moss throughout the foreground. The moss I'm going to use to do that is cushion moss. It's a lush green, slow-growing species which is perfect for beginners. I'm splitting it up into smaller chunks and then trimming off the base to make it shorter. This doesn't hurt the moss at all, but it means it can sit closer to the substrate, which will look better in this style terrarium. I'm placing it in small chunks at a time and then gently pressing it down onto the substrate. Now I'm going to repeat the same process throughout the foreground, and whilst I do that, let me quickly tell you about my terrarium making ebook. Building terrariums is super fun and rewarding, but it can seem a bit daunting and intimidating if you're a beginner. My ebook contains everything you need to know to make a long-lasting, successful terrarium with plenty of tips and tricks along the way. It will certainly give you a head start and help you avoid some of the unfortunate mistakes that all beginners go through. If you're interested, it'll be at the top of the description and in the pinned comment. Now let's get back to the build. Now the moss is in, I'm loving how this terrarium's looking and it's really starting to take shape. I have left a small gap down the centre and you'll see why I've done this shortly. Next I want to plant in this Boston fern towards the back to help fill out the background. Before planting it in, I'm going to firstly add some leaf litter on top of the substrate. Although these won't be visible, they'll certainly be beneficial for some of the creatures that I'll be adding later. They'll provide shelter and a source of food. Now let's get back to the planting. I've prepared this fern by taking it out the pot and removing as much of the soil as I can. After deciding where to place it, I'm going to use some long tweezers to dig a hole down into the substrate. I can then take the fern and plant the roots inside. All that's left to do is to gently compress the substrate in and around the roots and then it's good to go. I've got another Boston fern and I'm going to plant it the same way to fill out the left side. I think planting them ferns to fill out the background already makes this terrarium look 10 times better. Before going any further, I'm going to address the gap that I left down the centre. I've left it clear so I can create a sand path. Having a sand path is a simple and easy way of creating more detail and interest inside a terrarium. It does have its place and it doesn't look great in every scape, but I think it has the potential of looking good in this one. It does look a bit odd and out of place at the moment, but some small black lava rock will fix that. All I'm doing is placing some small pieces throughout the sand and it will really help make it look more natural. I want to know what you think. Do you like it with the path or without? Let me know in the comments. It's important not to let the moss and plants dry out when building the terrarium, so I like to give it a good spray down every now and then. The benefit of having lots of terrariums is that you can take cuttings from other builds and not have to buy as many plants when making a new one. This here is a terrarium that I made a good few months ago. It's super healthy and in need of a trim. All I'm doing is trimming off the stems and pulling out the cuttings. They'll send out new shoots and grow back in no time at all. The cuttings can then be planted into their new home. Now you might be wondering how they're going to survive without any roots, and the answer to that is simple. Once planted into the terrarium, these cuttings will send out new roots in no time at all. This is known as plant propagation, and a terrarium actually provides perfect conditions as the humidity and moisture level is high. Now I want to start adding some smaller plants to add some more detail and interest. This Pelea glauca is a great start. It's super easy to grow and stays relatively small, and I think it will add some nice variety to the leaf shape inside this terrarium. Next up is one of my favourite terrarium plants. I propagated this oak leaf creeping fig myself from just 2 or 3 cuttings. I am thinking about making a video showing you how to grow and propagate your own plants in small pots like these. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like to see. All I'm doing is using some scissors to take a few cuttings. I'm then using some long tweezers to go ahead and plant them inside the terrarium. I mainly want them growing up on the spiderwood branches. Next up, I've got some Begonia lita. This is a beautiful terrarium plant which has these stunning iridescent leaves. I'm hoping it's going to slowly grow and creep throughout the foreground. The wider variety of plants you use to have different leaf shapes, size and texture, the more natural your terrarium is going to look. The last plant I want to add is a few cuttings of this hydrocotta. You may or may not know, but this is actually an aquatic plant that loves to grow in terrarium conditions. So long as the humidity is kept high, it will thrive. I'm absolutely loving how the terrarium's looking with the plants in, and it truly is looking like a slice of nature. After a quick spray down, I now want to add a few more details to the hardscape. I've got some small spiderwood branches which I'm simply just going to place in and around the scape. I do this in a lot of my builds, and I really do think it adds another level of detail. There is a slight colour difference between the spiderwood roots and the spiderwood branches, but it won't take long for them all to blend in together. Now it's finally time to start adding some life. I'm going to add plenty of creatures to this ecosystem and even an apex predator at the end, but to start off I've got some springtails. Although these are the smallest creatures that I'll be adding, they're arguably the most important. These tiny hard-working bugs will keep the terrarium ecosystem clean by eating things like mould and decaying matter. This food is then processed and pooped out in the form of fertiliser for the moss and plants. The plants will then use these nutrients to grow, resulting in oxygen being produced, which all the creatures inside this ecosystem will use to live. It truly is amazing watching everything work together to keep the ecosystem thriving. Next to go in the terrarium, I've got 2 different types of isopods. This is the larger species of the 2, and they're absolutely stunning. They'll play a similar role to the springtails in breaking down decaying matter throughout the ecosystem. I'm introducing 10 of them that all range in size. They waste no time at all and get straight to exploring. Next to go in is these dwarf purple isopods. They're much smaller than the other species, but still a lot bigger than springtails. Although all these creatures will play a key role in keeping the ecosystem clean and healthy, they'll also serve another purpose. As you may have guessed, they'll also serve as a source of food for the predator that I'm going to add later. The next creature that I'm going to add to this ecosystem is some of these tiny adorable garlic snails. They stay unbelievably small, and this is about as big as they'll get. Although these tiny snails are often seen as pests, in my experience they leave the live plants alone and like to feed on decaying matter such as the leaf litter. Once everything is established, I'm going to add the predator, but for now I'm going to give the entire ecosystem a good spray down. When watering a terrarium, it's very important that you don't overwater. Only water until the substrate is damp. It should not be wet or soggy. Now all that's left to do is to place on a clear acrylic lid and let this ecosystem establish for a few weeks. Four weeks have passed, and I'm glad to say that this terrarium is doing great. It doesn't really look like it's grown in too much, but that's because I mostly selected slow growing plants. Some of the faster growing plants, such as the hydrocotta, will likely pick up their growth rate from this point on, as they've now established a healthy root system. You may have noticed that there is a slight mould outbreak on some of the spiderwood. I'm not worried about this at all, and it's completely normal for new terrariums to go through a mould phase in the first few weeks. The springtails and other microfauna will take care of it in no time. As expected, I haven't really seen much of the creatures living in here, as they do spend most of their time in the moss and in the substrate. With that said, if you look hard enough you can always see one or two going about their day. Before introducing the predator, I need to make one quick change. If I was to leave this lid as it is, I'm almost certain it's going to escape. I'm using some hot glue to fill in all the holes. Now it's time to take a look at the soon-to-be apex predator of this ecosystem. This here is a brown centipede. Although it might not look too scary, in the terrarium world it's a deadly predator. It will feed on the small microfauna such as the springtails, isopods and snails and help keep their population in check. Without further ado, let's get it inside the ecosystem. Feel free to drop your name suggestions in the comments below. It will spend most of its time living under the damp moss, but when nighttime falls, that's when it will go on the hunt. Although harmless to humans, they have venomous claws on the sides of their head which they'll use to catch their prey. I really hope you enjoyed this terrarium ecosystem build and found it useful. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future builds or updates, and thank you for watching. If you want to see me build another ecosystem, check out this video here. In this video, I'll show you how to make a simple but beautiful nano aquarium for some tiny cherry shrimp. I'm going to use this Nano 20cm cube aquarium. It's made from opti-white glass and it's already got a self-leveling mat on the bottom. I'll put a link to this tank plus all the other materials that I'll be using in the description. The first thing I want to do is get the background in place. I've cleaned the glass and now I'm placing on a frosted film. I can now use a plastic card to squidge out all the excess water. All that's left to do now is to use a sharp blade to trim it down around the edges of the tank. You certainly don't need a background, but I always think it makes the tank look a lot cleaner. As for the lighting for this tank, I've got this relatively low powered LED light. Now let's start building the ecosystem. Before pouring in the substrate, I'm going to place in this mesh bag of crushed lava rock. This will not only provide a place for beneficial bacteria, but it'll also mean I don't need to use as much substrate. As for the substrate, I'm going to use some Tropica aqua soil. In a small tank like this one, a 3 litre bag will be more than enough. I'm using my hand to slope the aqua soil up towards the back, which will help create more depth. I will add some more aqua soil soon, but firstly I'm going to place in some root tabs. Adding these will really help ensure that the plants inside this tank have enough nutrients to thrive. Instead of pushing them down into the substrate, I'm opening up the capsules and pouring them inside. After pouring in about 3 or 4 capsules, I can now cap it off with even more aqua soil. With the substrate complete, let's get to work on the hardscape. I've got a good selection of black lava rock which I think will be perfect for this nano aquarium. The scape I've got in mind is lava rocks on the left and right side of the tank with a narrow gap down the middle. I'll then turn the narrow gap into a sand path which will hopefully add a great level of detail to the tank. I'm happy with the placement of these 2 rocks, so what I'm going to do now is add even more substrate in behind them. By doing this, I'll hopefully be able to create a great sense of depth and make this nano aquarium look much deeper than it actually is. You can now see that the narrow path down the centre is starting to take shape. I will add some more substrate and 1 more layer of rocks before moving on. As the aqua soil is sloped up so steep, it does want to roll down towards the front, but giving it a good spray down helps it stay in place. I'm really liking how it's looking so far and I can already see my idea taking shape. I do think a few spiderwood branches will add a nice contrast to the black lava rock. After a bit of experimentation and superglue, here's how the right side looks. I like how it resembles roots growing over the lava rock. Now I'm going to try and do the same on the left side. Once I'm happy with the placement of the wood, I'm tearing off a small piece of tissue and placing it in between the wood and lava rock. I can then soak the tissue with some liquid type superglue. It dries really quickly and forms a strong bond which holds the wood in place. Once the glue dries, it becomes inert, making it 100% shrimp safe. I'm using multiple pieces of wood to create the illusion that they're one root system growing down over the rocks. I'm really happy with how it's looking, but the white glue marks certainly need to be covered up. To do this, I'm simply applying some superglue and then sprinkling on some crushed black lava rock. This is a super easy and quick way of creating a seamless joint between the wood and the rocks. By gluing everything together, it's made the hardscape nice and sturdy so it's not at risk of being knocked over. I do feel like it's missing some small detailed branches, so I'm going to add them first before moving on to the planting. That's looking much better, so let's start bringing this mini aquarium to life. These here are some pots of Monte Carlo which I've propagated and grown myself. I think this plant will look great in the foreground and in small patches on the left and right side of the sand path. I'm taking the plant and splitting it up into smaller individual sections. I can then take some long tweezers and plant it down into the substrate. I find it much easier to plant when the water level is pretty much at the same level as the substrate. These small patches will grow and spread in no time at all. Next up, I want to add a really nice pop of colour on the left and right side of the scape. I've got a bunch of Rotala cuttings from another tank that would do this perfectly. I want these to grow nice and tall, which will hopefully make the sand path look like it's in a deep valley. For this aquarium, I'm really trying to keep the planting as simple as possible and only use a few species. Don't get me wrong, tanks with loads of different plant species look amazing, but I certainly think there's a place for more simple setups like this one. The last plant I'm adding is a few patches of Bucephalandra. I'm able to wedge the majority of them in gaps between the hardscape, but I am using a small amount of superglue to attach a piece up on this lava rock. Now the planting's complete, I'm giving the tank a light spray down before pouring in the sand down the centre. I'm starting at the top and gradually making my way down to the front. To make an effective sand path, there's one very important thing that you need to do. You need to make sure that it's the widest at the front, with it gradually getting narrower and narrower as it makes its way to the back of the tank. This simple trick adds a great sense of depth as it makes the path look as if it's going off into the distance. Small pieces of lava rock on either side add to the detail, as well as some crushed lava rock sprinkled on top. I absolutely love the depth that the path brings to the tank, and I'm really happy with how the hardscapes turned out. Now let's move on and install the filter. I'm going to use this small hang-on back filter, and I want it to sit in this back corner. The intake, however, is way too long, so I am going to need to make a few customizations. I'm starting by cutting off this small bottom piece, which will allow me to attach the intake back on after cutting down the tube. Now I'm placing the filter on the tank and measuring out where I need to cut off. I can now take the small piece that I cut off and glue it back on. I'm making sure to only glue it on halfway, as the other half is where the intake will attach onto. Now the glue is dry, I can simply push the intake back in place, followed by the sponge, and place it back inside the tank. It fits in perfectly and it's really discreet, which is much better than having a filter inside the tank, which would take away from the overall scape. Before filling up the tank, I am going to make a quick change to the media inside the filter. I'm taking out the small cartridge it came with and replacing it with some ceramic rings and filter foam. Now there's a much greater area for beneficial bacteria and it's super easy to clean out. Now I'm going to quickly install the CO2 system. If you haven't got access to CO2, don't worry, as all the plants inside this setup will still grow great without it. The main difference is that they'll grow faster, more compact, and the reds will have a bit more colour to them. I've already got a CO2 system which is super easy to set up in my tanks, so that's why I'm using it. Now it's finally time to fill the tank up with water. A small piece of paper towel ensures that the water doesn't destroy the scape. All I use for my setups is dechlorinated tap water. All that's left to do is to turn the filter on and let the tank grow in and establish before introducing the shrimp. Six weeks have passed and I'm glad to say that this nano aquarium has established really nicely. All the plants have grown in just how I hoped they would, and the tank is almost unrecognisable from a month and a half ago. My favourite has got to be the dense forest of Rotala on the left and right side of the scape. I've trimmed and replanted the stems multiple times to achieve this look, and I'm really happy with it. The stems have grown a really healthy root system that go all the way down to the bottom of the tank. As I'm sure you remember, I did initially have CO2 running in this setup. I decided to remove it a few weeks ago as the plants were growing so fast that I couldn't keep up with the maintenance. Although the CO2 does help, it goes to show that you can still have a nice healthy setup without it. As for algae, there's some growing on the wood and rocks, but it's really not a problem. The shrimp will likely help clean this up in no time at all. Talking about the shrimp, I think it's about time to introduce them to their new home. These are red cherry shrimp and they're perfect for a small setup like this one. Hopefully there's a mix of males and females so they can start breeding, but if not, I'll introduce a few more from one of my other setups. After 6 weeks of having nothing in the tank, it's really nice to see these little guys running around and exploring. I want to hear your thoughts. Should I add anything else to this setup or leave it as shrimp only? Let me know in the comments. I absolutely love the simplicity of this setup and the fact that I only used 3 species of plants, yet it still looks like a miniature jungle. I really hope you enjoyed this video and thank you for watching. In this video, I'll turn this glass tank into a stunning drip wall moss paludarium. I'm going to use this tank that I built myself from an old aquarium. The plan is to have water slowly dripping down from the top of the tank into an open section of water at the front. Let's get straight into creating this, starting with the rocks that I'm going to use. These are maple leaf rocks and they've got some absolutely stunning detail. The purpose of these 2 pieces is to create a barrier between the land and water area. After a bit of trial and error, I've come up with this placement that I think will work quite well. It obviously looks a bit boring as it is, so let's improve the hardscape with some wood. I've got a few different pieces to choose from, so I'm going to take some time and try and find a layout that I'm happy with. This is spiderwood, but there's a bunch of different options you can choose from which will all achieve a different look. At the end of the day, it comes down to your personal preference and the kind of layout that you're trying to create. This is what I've settled on and I really like how it looks. Before moving on to the next step, I need to secure the wood to the rocks. To do this, I'm simply going to use some super glue. Now that it's nice and sturdy, I can move on to the next step. I'm going to use this expanding foam to build a background behind the wood and rocks. If I didn't glue the wood down, the foam would likely push it out of the way as it expands and dries. It's been over 24 hours and the foam is fully dried and ready to be carved down. To carve the foam, I'll simply use my fingers to rip off pieces. The goal is to shape it a bit more naturally, but I won't spend too much time on it as it's all going to be covered in moss and plants anyway. With the foam fully carved down, I'm going to add some more maple leaf rocks higher up the background. These will add some nice detail to the scape and they'll stand out really well once the entire background is covered in moss and plants. I definitely don't want them tumbling down and cracking the glass, so I'm going to glue them in place. At this point, you might be wondering how the water's going to flow down over the background. I'll be using this DIY mini canister filter to pull water from the front and push it out at the top of the background where it can slowly drip down. There's a tutorial on this channel showing you exactly how to make this filter in case you're interested. For this system to work properly, it's going to need some pipe work, so let's start by making the intake. This is a plastic drinking straw, and after taking some measurements, I'm blocking up one end with some tape. Next, I'm squeezing on a funnel and then filling the entire straw with some fine sand. Giving it a few taps helps the sand compress, which will give a better result in the end. I can now tape the end, blocking the sand inside before starting to shape. To shape the straw, I'm going to use a lighter and this jig, which you can probably tell I made myself. I'm using the lighter to gradually heat up the area of the straw that I want to bend. Now it's nice and flexible, I can take it to the jig and bend it in half. After about a minute, the plastic has hardened up and it's nice and strong. I'm now placing it back inside the tank and taking another measurement, which I'm then going to bend 90 degrees using the same method as before. That's this piece fully shaped, so I can now take off the tape and pour out the sand. I'm using a sharp blade to cut off the excess as it is a bit long. The reason I've added this 90-degree angle is to allow me to attach the tubing much easier. To finish off the intake, I'm going to cut some small slots where it can pull the water in. After placing on some tape, I'm making a few marks where I'm going to cut. Next is the tedious process of cutting 1/3 of the way into the straw on all the lines that I've made. This would probably be easier with a smaller saw, but you've got to work with what you got. The slots have been cut out, but it is a bit messy, so I'm going to tidy it up with a sharp blade. Running it under a flame for a second or two helps give it a nice clean finish. After adding a cap on the end and some suction cups to attach it to the glass, the intake is complete. The next task is to work on the output tube, which is going to be a spray bar that slowly drips water down the background. Once again, I'm using a long plastic straw and shaping it using the same method as I did earlier. As you can see, I've made some tight bends which makes it fit nice and neatly around the back of the tank. The next step is to make lots of small holes where the water can drip out. The easiest way of doing this is going to be melting holes into the plastic with this screwdriver. It's certainly not the neatest, but it should do the job just fine. I'm plugging up the end by wedging in some filter foam, and then it's time to get it attached in place. With the intake and output complete, I'm going to work on the decorative sand in the foreground. In these tubs I've got some fine sand, some small pea gravel and some larger pea gravel. I'm firstly going to add the fine sand. A paintbrush comes in handy to spread it out throughout the scape. Next I'm adding the small pea gravel, followed by the larger pieces. By mixing these different elements together, it helps create a natural looking foreground. Before adding any moss or plants, I'm going to install the canister filter and get the water flowing down the background. I'm connecting the filter to the pipes with some silicone tubing and then filling it up to prime it. Now I'm filling up the tank with water before turning on the pump. It's flowing absolutely perfectly, which is great to see on the first attempt, and the pump is also super quiet, which is definitely an added benefit. Usually when creating an expanding foam background like this one, I'd cover the entire thing in some silicone and something like cocoa fibre, but for this build I want to try something different. What I'm going to do instead is cover all the exposed foam with some live moss. I found all these pieces outside and I really love their vibrant green pillow-like appearance. To plant the moss, I'm simply placing it in the flow of the dripping water. This should keep it hydrated and allow it to grow out in the open air. As this moss is straight from outside, it's going to be an experiment to see how it gets on. Some will thrive in these conditions and some simply won't. In my opinion, it's always worth giving it a go. Some of the moss is sliding and not staying in place, so I'm going to use some toothpicks to pin it down. Instead of covering the entire scape with just one species of moss, I've left lots of gaps where I can add another. This is some sphagnum moss that I've grown myself, and I think it will look great growing in patches throughout the paludarium. In my opinion, using multiple different species will always help create a more natural looking scape. With all the moss planted in, the paludarium has really come to life. These are some small pieces of Anubias and Bucephalandra. I'm going to plant these in right around the waterline, and they should add some nice detail to the base of the paludarium. This here is some Christmas moss. It's an aquatic species that I think will look great growing in the water. I'd usually tie it to some stones or glue it to the hardscape, but this time I'm simply going to wedge it in between the rocks. wasn't going to plant any more plants into the moss, but I think I'll make an exception for this oak leaf creeping fig. I think its dark green leaves and climbing tendencies will add some nice detail to the higher areas of the scape. To plant it, I'm simply pressing it down onto the damp moss and it should send its roots down and start spreading in no time at all. After adding some floating plants to give the surface of the water a bit more detail, all that's left to do is let the paludarium establish before introducing some life. It hasn't been too long since I set this tank up, but for now it seems to be doing great. I have introduced a small group of cherry shrimp into the water. They're only about a month or so old, so they are super small, but they seem to be doing really well. I won't keep them in here long term, as I think they'll need a bit more room once they're fully grown, but it's going to be perfect to watch them grow out. I have added a small guard on the intake of the filter just to make sure no shrimp get sucked up. The dripping water has kept the moss nice and hydrated, which is great. Let's just hope it continues to thrive. I really hope you enjoyed this build, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. In this video, I'll show you how to make a thriving planted aquarium for one of the most beautiful creatures in the aquarium hobby. Obviously, I'm talking about a Siamese fighting fish, more commonly known as a Betta fish. Let's waste no time and get straight into the build. I'll be using this rimless glass aquarium and I'll put all the measurements up on screen now. The first thing that I want to do is make an adjustment to the glass tank. I'm going to use a sheet of acrylic to create a separate compartment where the filtration will take place. This will not only result in better filtration, but it will also mean I can hide equipment like the heater from the main part of the tank. I've taken some measurements of the internal dimensions of the tank and now I'm cutting the acrylic down so it fits inside. Ignore the grey colour as that's just the protective coating that I can peel off later. Now it's time to attach the piece that will separate the filter media from the filter. I'm using some sandpaper to scratch up the acrylic where I'm going to attach the barrier. This will help the glue hold much better. With a line of super glue in place, I can now carefully place on the barrier. One thing to note is that they're going to be locked together in just a second or two, so make sure you take your time to get it in the right place before attaching it. At the bottom, I'm attaching this small piece of egg crate which will allow the water to freely pass through whilst holding back the filter media. As I'm sure you can see, I've drilled out a square on the left which is where the water will flow in, and the hole on the right is where the water will be pushed back out by the pump. I've removed the protective coating from the acrylic so it can now be installed inside the aquarium. I'm applying a bead of silicone along the back and bottom before pressing it in place inside the tank. I'll use some more silicone to seal up the edges before leaving it to dry for 24 hours. It's the next day and I think it's turned out really well. Before moving on, let me quickly explain how it works and why it's beneficial. The water will overflow from the main part of the tank through this square and into this first section. This is where all the mechanical and biological filtration will be, and as you can see there's a lot of space for it. The water will then flow through the egg crate at the bottom into this section where a pump will push it back into the tank. Other equipment like a heater can also be placed in this second section. This means that no equipment will be visible inside the tank, and I think that looks much more natural than having something like a filter or heater blocking the view. Now let's move on to the lighting. The light for this build was kindly sent to me by Chihiros. This is their C2 RGB LED light. There's a bracket that mounts it on the side of the tank, and that makes it super easy to raise or lower depending on your preference. The light intensity and timer can all be controlled through an app, which is always super handy. This tank's going to sit on my desk where it's visible from the front and side angles, so I need to take that into account for the hardscape. I found this stunning piece of driftwood in my local fish shop and I think it has the potential to look really good inside this scape. Just like always, I'm taking some time to experiment with multiple different layouts, but this is slightly more difficult than normal as I need to make it look good from not one but two sides. Some of the branches are pushing right up on the glass, so I'm breaking them off to give it a better fit. I quite like how it sits here, but it definitely needs to be elevated, so let's add some substrate. For this aquarium, I'm going to use Tropica Aquasoil. I'm using my hand to slope the substrate up to the back right corner, as this is going to help create some depth. With that done, I can place the driftwood back inside and add even more detail with some rocks. These are Cereus stones. I think their light colour will contrast the dark wood and substrate really well. I'm trying not to overdo it with the stones, as I want to leave plenty of room for the plants. I'm pouring in some more aquasoil towards the back to build some more height, followed by a few more stones to add some more detail. I'm really happy with how the hardscape's looking so far, but there's a few things that need to be done before I can start planting. Once I fill the tank up with water, the wood is definitely going to float, which would destroy all the hard work that I've put into it. An easy solution to this is to use the superglue and tissue method to lock the wood to the rocks. All I'm doing is wedging in some tissue between the Cereus stone and wood and then soaking it in some liquid type superglue. It dries really quickly and it's 100% shrimp and fish safe. It's even strong enough to be pulled out as one entire piece, but I do like to add a few more contact points just to make sure that it holds up for the long term. As this aquarium is for a Betta fish, it's going to need a lid, so these branches out the top need to be trimmed down. I think the easiest way to do this is going to be completely removing the hardscape and then using some pliers to break down the branches. By using pliers instead of something like a saw, it will create a more natural break instead of a clean cut. After a bit of work, all the branches are sitting just below the top of the tank, which will allow a lid to sit nicely on top. I'm adding some more aquasoil in the back to build some more height, followed by adding a few more Cereus stones for some more detail. I love how this hardscape's turned out, and I think it looks great from not only the front but also the side as well. Before adding any plants, I'm going to give the entire tank a really good spray down. I want a carpeting plant that stretches all the way from the foreground in the front to the foreground in the side. I think a great plant for this would be Monte Carlo. It's super easy to grow and will form a dense carpet in no time at all. I've split a couple pots up into lots of smaller chunks and they can now be planted inside the aquarium. I like to use the tweezers to plant them nice and deep inside the aquasoil, as this stops them from floating up once the tank's filled up. To add some nice variety to the small round leaves of the Monte Carlo, I'm going to plant in some of this Crypt Parva. Its leaves stay extremely small and I think it'll add some nice detail at the base of the hardscape throughout the tank. Sticking with crypts, I've got another species that I think will look great inside this aquarium. I've never used this one before, so I'm excited to see how it looks after it starts to establish. I've split it into two chunks, planting the larger one on the right with a smaller one in this gap behind the Cereus stone. I'm going to go ahead and plant a few more species of crypts in the mid-ground areas throughout the tank. Now let's move on to planting the background, as it's looking quite empty. This here is a species of Rotala that has some really nice fine detailed leaves. I've never used this plant before, so I'm not completely sure how it's going to grow, so I guess I'll just have to wait and find out. The stems should grow right to the surface of the water and get more colourful as they do so. I'm liking the planting so far, but there's definitely a few more species that I want to add before filling the tank up with water. A light spray down every now and then helps keep the plants nice and hydrated and stops them from drying out. This is Trident Fern and I think it will look really good growing amongst the tall branches of the driftwood. It's an epiphyte, so I haven't got to plant it in the substrate and I can simply wedge it in gaps between the wood. Next to go in is some Bucephalandra and Anubias. These are slow growing epiphytic plants that will add some really nice detail to the aquarium. I've cleaned off all the rock walls so they can now be planted throughout the scape. In some areas there's no gaps that I can wedge them into, so I'm using a small amount of superglue to mount them in place. I'm mainly planting them around the driftwood as that's where I think they look most natural. I'm really liking the planting so far, but I think it can look even better with a couple additions. I'll quickly show you how to make these mossy stones that you can freely place throughout the scape. You'll need some small pieces of rock, it doesn't matter what kind they are as they'll be covered up anyway. Some thread and then some moss or liverwort that you want to use. I'm using Riccardia, which is a species of liverwort. I'm tying the thread around the rock and then placing some Riccardia on top. I can then wrap the thread around to lock it down, tie it off and then cut off the excess. These mossy rocks are really quite simple to make and in my opinion I prefer it to the glue. They're super easy to place inside and you can even move them or take them out completely if you ever wanted to. Before I can fill the tank up with water, I need to get the filtration sorted. As I mentioned at the start, the water will flow through this first section, down through the egg crate into the second section where it will be pushed back into the tank. In the first section, I'll start by adding some ceramic rings which will do the bulk of the work in terms of biological filtration. On top of that, I'm adding some filter foam followed by some fine filter floss which will help polish the water and keep it crystal clear. This is the pump that will push the water from the second chamber back into the aquarium. It's a small USB pump that's even adjustable, which is always handy. I've built this output tube that attaches to the pump with some tubing and push fittings. The end lines up perfectly with the hole that leads back into the tank. I've then created this output nozzle from an acrylic drinking straw that goes into the push fitting. I created the shape by heating it up and using the back of a Sharpie to open up the end. I think this output will work really well as it can easily be removed whenever I need to clean the pump. Although it probably is a bit overkill, I think this filtration system will work really well for this tank. Now I think it's time to fill the aquarium up with water. The bubble wrap helps disperse the water and stops it from disrupting the aquasoil, which would likely uproot the plants. The water is nothing special and it's just dechlorinated tap water. Now that the tank is filled up, I can turn on the pump and see how everything works. Everything's working really well, and the bonus of the overflow filtration is that it also skims the surface and keeps it nice and clean. Before I can leave the tank to grow in, I need to set the light up properly. I'll have it on 50% power to start with and set the timer up so it's on for 6 hours a day. I'll slowly increase the intensity week by week until it's close to 100%. Doing this gradually helps reduce algae at the start. I'll place the CO2 diffuser in the back part of the tank where the small bubbles can be sucked up by the filter and blown into the tank. CO2 certainly isn't essential, but it will help with the plant growth. Now that the aquarium's all set up, all that's left to do is to leave it to grow in and establish. After 4 months of growth, this aquarium is completely transformed and I'm really happy with how it looks. With that said, it hasn't been the smoothest journey and there has been a couple battles with algae. It was mainly growing throughout the Monte Carlo carpet and on the stems in the background. I'm glad to say it's mostly cleared up, but there is a few patches here and there if you look closely. At the moment, the only inhabitants are a few Amano shrimp, but I really can't wait to introduce the Betta fish. As you may have noticed, I have added a white background to the tank. I think it makes the green plants pop much better and I think it frames the aquarium in really well. As for other changes, I've added some small black strips to create a grid on the overflow section to stop any creatures from being sucked in. The filter box is still working great, but I do need to make an addition. I'm adding a heater which will help keep the water at a stable temperature of 24 degrees. This is a must if you plan on keeping a Betta fish. They're also known for jumping out of aquariums, so I'm placing on a lid to ensure this never happens. Each corner has a small pad of silicone which will help stop the glass from sliding around on the top of the tank. I'll leave the tank for a day or so to get to the proper temperature before introducing the Betta fish. A few days have passed and the tank is now home to a stunning male Betta fish. I really love his blue coloration and I think it pops out against the green plants really well. He's certainly not shy and loves to explore the tank and swim amongst the plants. I'm definitely going to need help with a name, so be sure to drop your suggestions in the comments below. As I mentioned at the start, this tank will be sitting on my desk, so it's going to be great to have some company whilst I'm editing videos. Despite the battles with algae, I'm really happy with how this tank's turned out and I think it looks really clean without any equipment visible inside the tank. Once again, be sure to drop your name suggestions in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching. In this video, I'll be making a giant multi-species ecosystem that's not only home to fish and shrimp, but also a group of deadly predators known as vampire crabs. I'll be following the Paludarium from day 1 all the way to day 150, and believe me, it completely transforms. Let's waste no time and get straight into the build. It's going to be a good one. I'll be building the Paludarium inside this 160 litre aquarium. As for the lighting, I'm not going for anything crazy and I'm just using this budget Nano aquarium light. It's very affordable and comes with a dimmer and built-in timer, which is always handy. I've got some cork panels and I think they'll be perfect for the background inside this Paludarium. I'm using a sharp blade to cut this panel in half before giving it a quick test fit inside the tank. They fit nice and snug for now, but I will have to attach them more permanently. I've gone ahead and cut the sides out as well, and I'm already starting to like how it looks. It is really flat and boring at the moment, but I'll show you some techniques shortly that will add some really nice detail. To attach the cork panels to the glass, I'm going to use some aquarium silicone. I'm applying a generous amount onto the cork panel and then going ahead and pressing it down onto the glass. It holds it in place right away, but it will take a good 24 hours for it to fully cure. I've attached all the panels and left them overnight to dry. To add some more depth and interest to the background, I'm going to add a few cut-offs in certain places. Toothpicks come in handy to temporarily pin them down in place. The rectangular shape obviously doesn't look very natural, so I'm breaking off the edges. I can then use more silicone to attach the cork panels together before going ahead and placing them inside the tank. This is a really easy and simple way to add some nice depth and interest to a once flat, boring background. I've saved you some time and attached a few more throughout the tank and waited till the next day for them to dry. They're all nice and sturdy, which is perfect. As I'm sure you're aware, the background isn't looking too natural at the moment with the sharp edges and flat faces, so let's change that. I'm going to carve down the foam with a drill that has a wire brush attachment. If you haven't got a drill, a handheld wire brush also works well. All I'm doing is carving down the surface of the foam to create some nice texture, as well as giving it some high and low points. You can be as creative as you want on how you carve down the cork panels, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it as the majority will be covered in moss and plants anyway. After about half an hour of carving, here's the result. It's certainly nothing crazy, but I like how it looks and I think it will serve as a great background for this ecosystem. As I'm sure you can see, it does create quite a mess at the bottom of the tank, so let's get that cleaned up. The best way I've found to remove all of this is scooping out as much as you can and then going around with a hoover. I'm also making sure to go over the cork panels as well, as a lot of it is stuck between the gaps. With the tank clean and the background in place, the Paludarium is really starting to take shape. Now I'm going to start working on the hardscape. I've got a good selection of these large maple leaf rocks and I think they'll fit the scape that I've got in mind really well. I'm firstly placing in some pieces of foam that would distribute the weight of the rocks and help protect the glass. Now I can start placing in the maple leaf rocks. The main purpose of these large rocks is to create a barrier that will separate the water area from the land area. They'll create a retaining wall that will hold substrate back and stop it from getting into the water. At this stage, it's really important to take your time, as these rocks will create a foundation and quite literally determine the rest of the scape. After many hours of placing the rocks in and pulling them back out, here's the layout that I've came up with. My favourite part about it has got to be this indented bay area where the water will be a lot shallower, being only an inch or two deep. I'm hoping it will serve as a hotspot for crabs to relax in where they haven't got to venture out into deeper waters. There's no way I can build a scape like this without creating some kind of flowing water feature. I've placed a small pump in the corner of the tank, and now I'm using some egg crate light diffuser to create a box around it. I'll attach these two pieces together with some zip ties. This will allow me to access the pump once the build is complete and change it or clean it if I ever needed to. It fits around the pump nicely, so I'm going to go ahead and attach it in place with some super glue. Whilst the glue dries, I'm going to cut down this filter foam so it fits nicely around the pump box. These will help filter out the water as it gets pulled into the pump. As for the water feature, I've got this cool piece of driftwood which I think will look great with water running down the centre. I want it to sit here where the water can flow down it into the open bay area. My plan is to build a structure right at the top for the water to flow down like a stream into the back of the driftwood and then out into the open water. This might be a bit ambitious, but I think it's worth a go. To start off, I'm attaching the driftwood to the background using the super glue and tissue method. Now that it's dry and nice and sturdy, I can start building the skeleton for the flowing waterfall. I've got some toothpicks and I'm going to poke them into the cork panel to act almost like scaffolding. I'm going to add some expanding foam shortly to build the structure, and these toothpicks should hold it in place and stop it from falling straight to the floor. For the areas where the toothpicks can't reach, I'm using some long wooden skewers snapped in half. Now this really does look like an absolute mess, but trust me, it should make sense soon. If I applied the foam now, it's likely going to expand through all the gaps in the egg crate. A piece of cardboard along with some filter foam in the top will help fix that problem. Now it's time to start building the waterfall structure with the expanding foam. I'm applying it in between and on top of the wooden toothpicks that I pushed into the background. As you can see, it's holding the foam up in place really well, and this makes a really good alternative to having to flip the tank over on its back. I'm pushing in a few more toothpicks as I want the foam to come out a bit further in this area. I'm trying not to apply overly too much as it does expand a lot, as you can see here. A few hours have passed and the foam is fully hardened, and it really is quite solid, which is great. Before carving the foam down, I like to use a marker pen to quickly sketch out a guide to follow. The red line is the path I want the water to take, and I find doing this step makes carving much easier. To carve the foam down, all I'm using is my hands to pull off chunks. I've made good progress with the carving, but I've had an idea that I think can add another level of detail to this ecosystem. I want to try and create a dark cave area right here underneath the flowing waterfall. This maple leaf rock should do the job. After a bit of experimentation with a large rock, here's what I've came up with. I really like the dark and gloomy aspect that it brings to the tank, and I think it will be a great hiding area for the vampire crabs. It is a bit wobbly, and the last thing I want is for it to fall down and crack the glass, so I'm going to use some super glue and tissue to lock it down in place. Now that it's nice and sturdy, I can use some more expanding foam to fill in the void behind it. Now it's dry, I'll save you some time and carve it down off camera. All the foam has now been carved down, and as I'm sure you can see, it's really not looking too natural, so I'll fix that shortly. I should mention I've made a hole in the top of the foam, which is where the outlet of the pump will go and the water will flow down from. Covering up the expanded foam is going to make a big mess, so I'm removing all the rocks from the tank, which will make the cleanup easier. What I'll be using is some black aquarium silicone along with some crushed maple leaf rocks. To make this, I simply put some rocks in a bag and crush them down with a hammer. I'm firstly going to apply some black silicone onto the expanding foam. I'll then use my finger to spread it out and try and get it in all the gaps and cracks. I'm now taking the crushed rock, pouring it on top and pushing it down into the silicone. I'll repeat the same process until all the foam is covered in maple leaf rock. I do recommend working in small patches at a time, as the last thing you want is for the silicone to dry before you get the rocks on. I've covered the entire waterfall, let it dry for 24 hours and brushed off all the excess. I'm really happy with how it's looking, but as you can see there is still a few patches of foam that I missed. Instead of using more silicone and having to wait 24 hours for it to dry, I'm using super glue, which is a much quicker alternative. Now the waterfall's done, I can get all the hardscape back inside the tank. Now before I get any drainage or substrate into the land area, I need to patch in these holes between the maple leaf rocks, or it's all going to spill out into the water area. The easiest way to do this is to take some filter floss and push it into the holes. You won't be able to see it by the end, as I'll easily be able to hide it with moss and plants. Now it's time to pour in the drainage layer for the land area. What I'm using for this is Leaker. It's lightweight and porous, making it perfect for this task. The purpose of the drainage layer is to build an elevated foundation that the substrate can then sit on top of. This will stop the substrate getting waterlogged from constantly sitting in water. It's important that the depth of the drainage layer is above the intended depth of the water inside the paludarium. In this case, the drainage layer is roughly 14 centimeters deep, and I intend for the water to be about 9 to 10 centimeters deep. Before going any further, I really want to test out the pump and see how the waterfall flows. I've attached a long tube to the pump that goes down to the bottom of the filter box that I made earlier. It has a 90-degree push fitting at the end that fits nicely into the top of the waterfall. Now that some water's in the tank, let's give it a test run. This is certainly not what I intended, but it's nothing a few adjustments can't fix. After slightly changing the angle and adding a small piece of filter foam, it flows much better. I really love how it flows through the driftwood and trickles down into the water. The black filter foam is only temporary, as I'll be able to create the same effect with moss later. With the water feature working just how I hoped, I'm going to clear out the tank and start working on the substrate. First off, I'm going to place in some window screen mesh that will act as a substrate barrier and stop the substrate from getting down into the drainage layer. On top of this, I'm going to pour in some crushed lumpwood charcoal that will help remove any impurities inside the ecosystem. Now I can start getting the substrate in. I'm using a slightly different mix to normal, which will hopefully help the crabs inside this ecosystem thrive. I'll put the mix up on screen now. For my regular viewers, you'll notice that it doesn't contain charcoal and it does contain a higher ratio of worm castings. The reason for this is that I know vampire crabs like to burrow and I don't want their tunnels collapsing. I've tested this mix and it holds up well against caving. The camera really flattens it out, but the substrate is about 10 centimeters deep at the back. For the cave on the right side, I'm taking a slightly different approach due to the water feature. This area is going to have water constantly dripping through it, so I don't want to use regular substrate as I'm worried it will stagnate and leach into the water. I've chose aqua soil as it holds up much better when constantly wet. Now the substrate's in, I can get back to work on the hardscape. I've got a few of these driftwood branches which I think will look great inside this tank. The idea is to place them in to make them look like they're all joined together and one large piece of wood. Some time has passed and here's what I've come up with so far. I hope you can see what I mean when I said that I want it to look like one piece of driftwood instead of just individual branches. It's currently balancing in place with some wooden skewers, which obviously isn't a long-term fix. I'm going to get it secured in place with the superglue and tissue method. I'm wedging a small piece of tissue between the wood and cork panel and then soaking it in liquid type superglue. I'll ensure that each piece has multiple contact points to make sure it's nice and sturdy and not going anywhere. I'll then continue building it up piece by piece. Here's how it's looking and I'm really happy with it. I still feel like the scape is a bit empty, so I've got a few bits that I want to add. The first is some driftwood on the right, and then I want something in this open area of water on the left. I got hold of this really cool spiderwood root which I think will work perfectly. The bulk of the wood will sit above the water, but it's got these pieces that reach down and will create a nice sheltered area for all the life inside the water. Next, I'm going to get to work on the shallow bay area of the paludarium. I want this area to only be a few centimeters deep and taper out into the open water. I'm filling up a mesh bag with some aqua soil. I want there to be lots of plants in this area, so this will provide the nutrients. I'm now pouring on some gravel to fill in any gaps around it and give it a centimeter or two layer on the top. I've added a couple rocks towards the front to stop the gravel from rolling out into the foreground. I'm now going to start working on the decorative gravel layer at the base of the paludarium. I'm starting by pouring in some coarse gravel followed by some fine sand. Next I'm adding some natural pea gravel mainly around the base of the maple leaf rocks. Now some smaller maple leaf rocks can be placed throughout the foreground and I think that'll do it. I'm really happy with how the foreground's turned out and I think the combination I chose of sand, gravel and rocks really adds to the natural look. With the hardscape complete, this ecosystem is looking better than I could imagine and I can't wait to get some plants in. Before I get started adding the plants, I'm giving the entire paludarium a really good spray down. There's going to be a whole load of plants going in this build, but let's kick it off with this fern. I've taken it out the pot and removed all the soil. I can now dig a small hole into the substrate, plant the roots inside, and then compress the substrate back down around it. Sticking with ferns, I've got a couple nice clumps of trident fern. I'll split these up even further and plant them in gaps and cracks throughout the scape. I'm mainly trying to plant it right on the water's edge so its roots will be underneath the water and its leaves will be above. I've got even more trident fern, but this piece is mounted onto a piece of spiderwood. This is even easier to plant as I can simply place it inside the paludarium, and it also adds to the detail of the hardscape. I think this open patch on the right side will look good with a lush carpeting plant. I've got some Monte Carlo which should be perfect for this. I'm using my hands to plant in small patches, and with time they'll send out runners and form one dense carpet. Next, I've got this really unique plant nicknamed the mini palm tree plant. It grows great in humid setups like this one, but I'm not sure how it would do growing in the aquasoil, but I think it's worth a go. Every now and then I'm making sure to give the tank a good spray down to make sure the plants don't dry out. I know I've finished with the hardscape, but I keep on getting sidetracked with new ideas to add even more detail. I'm placing in this piece of driftwood to look like an old tree stump that was growing on the water's edge. I do think it adds some nice detail. Now back to the planting. I've got various species of Anubias and Bucephalandra that I'm planting throughout the tank. These plants are epiphytes, so to plant them you can simply wedge them inside gaps and cracks. Alternatively, you can even use a small amount of gel type superglue to mount them in place like I'm doing here. Similar to the trident fern, I'm planting them at a level where their roots will be underneath the water and their leaves will be growing up above. This will allow the roots to pull nutrients from the water to keep it nice and clean, and it'll also give the leaves easy access to CO2 in the air. Next to go in is this Alternanthrum mini. Its leaves are a brown colour at the moment, but under good lighting it grows really nice vibrant red leaves. Next up is this miniature begonia. It's got these stunning small iridescent leaves. I'm laying it on top of some damp sphagnum moss and I'm hoping it will slowly climb up the cork panels. As you might have noticed, there's a lot of white glue marks where I glued the hardscape down in place. These will be easy enough to cover up. I've placed in some damp sphagnum moss and now I'm going to plant in this oak leaf creeping fig. Whilst planting this, I've had a sudden idea that I think could look really cool. As you know, I made a few parts of the background pop out that give it a bit more depth. With this one, I'm going to use a sharp blade to cut out a pocket inside it. Now that there's a decent sized pocket cut out, I'm going to place inside some sphagnum moss. I can now take some more oak leaf creeping fig and plant it on top. I think it will look really cool if this entire section of background is completely carpeted with this climbing plant. I'm going to plant a few patches of this hygrophila and some crypts, and then I'm going to move on to planting the waterfall. I want lots of moss and plants growing around the water feature, but I think it's best to get it up and running before planting them. I've placed in a square of filter foam inside the filter box, followed by the pump. I'm now cutting some more filter foam to size that will block up the hole. I'm taking extra care to make sure there's no holes whatsoever so no creatures get down towards the pump. A small piece of driftwood on the top covers up the foam and makes it look a whole lot better while still giving me easy access if I ever need to access the pump. Now that the water feature is good to go, let's get some water inside the paludarium. I'm slowly filling it up to avoid disrupting the sand or plants too much. I'm only filling it about halfway, but that'll be more than enough to get the waterfall flowing. It's so good to see the waterfall flowing just as I hoped it would, and you can really get a glimpse of how the bay area is going to look. Once filled up, it will only be an inch or so deep, and I think it will look really good with the water gently flowing out into the open tank. I'm going to plant some moss throughout the waterfall, starting with this edge here. I'm going to use an aquatic species of moss known as Christmas moss. The main requirement when planting is that the moss is in contact with some water, as this will keep it damp and stop it from drying out. With time, it will slowly spread over the hardscape. I'll also use this moss to cover up any glue marks throughout the tank. I'm using some tweezers to poke a hole down into the foam, and then I'm going to plant some hygrophila inside. Although these cuttings have no substrate, they'll pull their nutrients from the water flowing through them. I think another carpet of Monte Carlo on the left here will add to the tank nicely. I'll also plant a crypt right behind it, which will grow denser and taller with some time. Now that the majority of the planting that will grow above the water is done, let's start getting in some plants that will grow under it. I want a fine-leaved plant in the bay area that the fish and shrimp can swim amongst. I think some hairgrass is going to be absolutely perfect for this. I've switched off the waterfall and I'm using some long tweezers to plant small clumps down into the gravel. Once it grows in a bit denser, I think it will serve as a really good refuge for baby shrimp and fish to hide out. Throughout the rest of the tank, I'll plant in a few more species, mainly around the rocks, that will grow in nicely with some time. After placing in a few more patches of moss and planting in some more climbing plants in the background, I can get the paludarium filled up with water. The waterfall can now be switched back on. This small section of the tank has by far got to be one of my favourites. I can't wait to see life swimming amongst the plants and enjoying this unique part of the tank. I think floating plants are going to be a great addition to this tank, as they'll add some nice detail to the water's surface and also provide an extra layer of cover for the creatures I'll be adding later. This paludarium is not going to work without a lid, as the plants inside require high humidity and the vampire crabs that I'm going to add later will easily escape, which is something we definitely don't want. I've built these lids myself with some picture frame glass along with some window screen mesh to improve the airflow. I've made 3 of them to sit on top of the tank, with the one on the right having the corner cut out to allow the wire to easily feed through. I'll plug any remaining holes around the wire with some filter foam. These 2 gaps then get covered up with long strips of glass that have a suction cup attached to the top. These will allow me to easily spray the tank with water or place in some food without having to take one of the lids off. I'm really happy with this lid design, and there's only tiny minimal gaps, so I haven't got to worry about escapees. To further improve the airflow, I'm going to add a couple USB fans that will sit on the left and right side of the tank. I've glued on some black skewers and mounted them to some suction cups that allows me to easily remove them whenever I need to take the lids off. I've hooked them up to a timer that turns on multiple times a day for a few minutes to blow fresh air inside the tank. In a big tank like this one, good airflow is going to help reduce mould and stop the glass from being constantly steamed up. The paludarium's complete, but trust me, it's going to completely transform over the coming months, so don't go anywhere. It's been 6 weeks since I set this paludarium up, and I'm glad to say that it's been thriving. I'll be documenting this tank all the way up to day 150 and adding some amazing creatures as I go. Above the water, the plants have started to grow in really nicely, but below is a different story. For the most part, it's not looking too bad, but there has been a bit of an algae problem. It's mainly growing on the dwarf hairgrass inside the shallow bay area. I'll add some creatures shortly that will help tackle this issue. It's quite hard to notice, but I've installed a small water pump on the left side of the tank, as there really wasn't much water movement over here. As for the waterfall, it's still flowing perfectly, and the moss I planted around it has spread so much and got so much new growth. I completely forgot to film it, but 6 weeks ago when I made this ecosystem, I did add some springtails and isopods, which have been working hard to keep this ecosystem clean and healthy. With that said, I think the water needs its own cleanup crew, so I think it's about time we add some creatures. This is a small group of red cherry shrimp. They'll not only add some dynamic life to the water, but they'll also help clean up the algae and eat decaying plant matter. It's been just over 3 weeks since the last look at this ecosystem, and the plants have continued to grow in really well. The oak leaf creeping fig has slowly been spreading and climbing up the background just like I hoped it would. Now let's take a look into the water, as something really exciting has happened. Not only have the shrimp been hard at work cleaning the algae, but they've also had some tiny babies. They're no older than a day old and haven't even got any red coloration yet. The crazy thing is that only one of the females' eggs have hatched, and there's still 3 more females with loads of eggs that are going to hatch in the coming days. This will cause an explosion in the population, but I'm not too worried about that, as I'll soon be introducing some predators that will help keep their numbers in check. This won't be for a few weeks yet, so let's first get some maintenance done. Some of the oak leaf creeping fig has grown right to the top of the tank, so I'm going to trim it down and replant it in a way that will help it grow more horizontally. I'm also going to trim back a few of the other plants that are getting a bit tall. I'm making sure to replant the cuttings as this will help create some denser growth. As for other maintenance, I've been doing a water change every few weeks and spraying the tank down once a day. The Paludarium is now over 100 days old and it really has gone from strength to strength. The cherry shrimp have been doing their job as there's pretty much zero algae to be seen. The babies that were born just over 6 weeks ago have grown in so much and are working just as hard as their parents. Talking about the parents, they've just hatched another 40 plus shrimp, so I think it's about time for some predators to help keep the population in check. I'm introducing 8 of these beautiful emerald rasboras. They're a dwarf species that won't be getting much bigger than this, so they'll only be hunting the small shrimplets. The shrimp population won't be completely depleted as there'll always be a handful that survive by hiding amongst the dense plant growth. The Paludarium is now 18 weeks old and it keeps on looking better and better as the weeks go by. I'll be introducing the apex predators into this ecosystem soon, but first let's take a look under the water to see how life is unfolding. The emerald rasboras have been doing a great job at maintaining a healthy shrimp population. They're a lot less shy than they once were and there's always a few of them out and about at any given time, which is great to see. Despite them only being tiny creatures, they do seem to be very territorial. There seems to be about 3 groups that control different areas of the tank. A group occupies the deeper, calm waters on the right side of the tank, with another group that dart in and out of the shallow bay area, and another that enjoy the faster flowing waters on the left side of the tank. It really is great to observe this behaviour, and I think it's safe to say that they're thriving inside this setup. One of my favourite things is seeing how much they enjoy the extremely shallow water inside the bay. There's always a few hanging out in there despite them being hard to spot due to their effective camouflage. Without further ado, it's about time to introduce the creatures that this ecosystem was designed for. This is a vampire crab. They're a semi-terrestrial freshwater species native to Indonesian rainforests. Don't let their slow movement fool you as they're deceivingly fast. Believe it or not, that's not been sped up whatsoever. They use this speed to escape potential threats and to catch their prey. Now let's introduce them to their new home. This first crab makes its way to the water's edge to take some shelter under a leaf. I'm going to be adding 4 in total and I think it's best I add them to separate areas of the tank so they have their own space to settle in. This next one is wearing a mossy wig, so it ran straight to the water to wash it off and have a refreshing bath. This crab seemed a bit hesitant and didn't want to come out, but after some gentle encouragement with some tweezers, it was soon exploring the tank. I introduced the last one into the back left corner of the tank, and now I think it's best to let them settle in for a good few weeks. The Paludarium is now 150 days old and I think it's safe to say that it's looking better than ever. It really is amazing just how much the plants have grown in the 22 weeks that this tank has been set up. For reference, here's how it looked on day 1 and here's how it looks today. It really has transformed into a lush slice of nature and it's truly been a joy to watch. My favourite angle to look into this tank has got to be from above. It really feels like you're peering through a window into the rainforest. Before showing you how the crabs are getting on, I do want to take a closer look at some of the plants. The oak leaf creeping fig is slowly but steadily covering the background and I absolutely love how it looks. The begonia lita that I planted in the substrate has made its own way onto the cork background and I think it adds some nice variety to the oak leaf creeping fig. A true highlight of the tank for me is the flowing waterfall with the lush moss and plants that are growing around it. Dare I say it, but it might need a trim back soon as you can barely see the water flowing down until it gets to the driftwood. When it comes to the water section inside the Paludarium, it's continued to flourish with the fish and shrimp thriving. The shrimp have continued to breed and are at a healthy population. They really have done a great job at keeping the tank clean, as there's no algae to be seen anywhere. As for the emerald rasboras, they seem to be getting more and more confident each and every day, which is great to see. One concern you might have is whether the vampire crabs are eating the fish and shrimp. I can definitely say they haven't got any of the fish, as all 8 are still alive and healthy. As for the shrimp, I definitely can't count them all up, so I'm not completely sure. There's certainly no dent in the population, so my best guess is that the shrimp are just too fast and agile for them. Talking about the crabs, let's take a look at how they're getting on inside the paludarium. Similar to the rasboras, they seem to have occupied their own territories throughout the ecosystem. This one occupies the dark cave area underneath the waterfall. I often catch it venturing out on top of the waterfall to snack on some algae that's growing amongst the moss. Not gonna lie, if I was a crab, this is probably the spot I'd choose. All the way on the other side of the tank lives this vibrant individual. This crab seems to control the back left corner of the tank and enjoys venturing out onto the side of the cork bark and on the top of the spiderwood. Although I can't confirm it, it likely has a burrow back there where it spends most of its time in the day, so this is a lucky appearance. Talking about burrows, here's one that can be seen. Right underneath the driftwood is a hole that a vampire crab has dug out. I often catch it right at the entrance of the burrow, but I haven't managed to get it on camera as it always scurries down before I can press record. As for the last crab, I'm not completely sure where it lives, but my best guess is amongst the dense plant growth right here. It really has been amazing to watch the creatures inside this setup thrive, and it's been an absolute joy to watch this ecosystem transform from day 1 all the way to day 150. I'd love to hear what you think of this build in the comments and what other livestock you'd potentially add. This certainly won't be the last you see of this paludarium, as I've already got some changes and additions that I want to make, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video and thank you for watching.